Geez, I wish my bloody kids would do that. Hey, welcome everybody. My name's Ewen, for those of who don't know. And I'd like to dive straight into thanking a few people. And last week I put this, last Friday, I put this person first, and I'd like to do it again. First thanks, and that's to my wife. Can be pretty hard work being my wife. Take it from me. Then I'd like to move on to some people who have sponsored us and helped us. And first and foremost, Fibre Fresh. I got in touch with Tom, and instead of giving what I asked for, he doubled it. And so, real big thanks to Tom and Fibre Fresh. Waikato Vets, some of you guys have probably had a little bit to do with them, Alex Jorgensen, and so big thanks to them. Equibred, I'm sure people down here know Equibred. IRT, that's International Racehorse Travel, who bring the horses in. I'm bloody sure I own just about half one of those damn planes. And Equestrian Sports New Zealand, and I'd just like to talk a little bit about that, and big thanks to Linda and Julian. I approached these guys about this, and they didn't hesitate to get in and support. I suspect a little bit, it's easy to criticise, isn't it? And I think it's something that I have been reasonably good at doing once in a while. But to then step forward, and because I said to myself one day, I was actually coming back from a meeting we had up at Takapo, and I thought, well, what the hell have I ever done? And it's a little bit about what drove me to do this and ask for support. So many thanks to you guys. So why are we here? It's about gaining the knowledge to improve and increase our mare herd in New Zealand, our competitive horses, because I do believe it needs to be done, and one thing I am sure of is that we do have the ability to do it. But then we turn to people like these two to give us a hand, and I'll introduce them soon. Another group of people I need to, I'll go back a little bit. When I did this, I set out to do three things, and one was to increase and improve. Two was to get breeders together, get us talking, get us into groups, getting us helping each other. It's all very fine being competing against each other, but it's a hell of a lot better if we do compete against each other, but work with each other, support each other, be pleased for everyone's successes. And the third thing that was really important to me was that when Michael and Emma leave New Zealand, they take New Zealand in their heart with them, and hopefully we've done that. And to achieve that, I'd like to give a big thanks to Wendy and Richard Cadell at Mountview Sport Horses. Gareth Dunkley, he's Wallingford, and he's getting into the breeding now, and I suspect we'll see some good things come out of there. Takapoto and Plor family, big thanks to them. When I first thought about this, going to Equestrian Sports New Zealand, I went and had talked to Mitch about it, and he was just super supportive. But I'd also like to go a little bit further here, and as I did last week, this family has been just absolutely tremendous to show jumping sport in New Zealand. You guys might not see as much of it down here, but the impact it's had on the North Island, the sport in the North Island is just huge. And for a family to go out and build a facility like that they have, like, where do you stop thanking them? Like, I think it's just amazing. And I would really like everyone just to put their hands together. Next person is me and my wife. No, I'm taking the piss there. All right, Daniel and Chrissy Webb, down at Webb Equestrian. They're down in Hunterville, and they just didn't hesitate to get on board. Charlene Workman down at Extreme. Excuse me. Warwick Hansen at Halpbury Sport Horses. Warwick, as most people know, was involved in NZPH for quite a long time. Ike Baker and family. Ike is a young guy in the North Island who got in sport dust, but he's a rider doing a bit of breeding, but he's also doing his academics, and he was very excited to talk to Emma and host these guys and pick brains because he's going overseas to study. He's doing his masters at the moment and working towards a doctorate, and we as a sport have just got to encourage people like Ike to get in and do that sort of thing. You. It's all her fault. Jenny came and stayed home one night, and the next day she sent me a podcast which I listened to, and then I listened to the next one, and then I downloaded the next 17. I actually haven't got through them all, don't tell Michael, but I'm working through it, and it is basically changed my thinking about what I'm doing. And I would encourage everyone, if they haven't already listened to those podcasts, it's well worthwhile. Take notes, and you'll never regret it. Penny and Mike Tapley. I don't know where to stop thanking these two. Penny just got right in beside me and supported me with this initiative and looked after the South Island end, and in the end just about everything else. And so big thanks to you two. That's all right. We also got support from Paul, Pip and Phoebe folks. The passion that this family have put into this sport over the last 20 years, I think, is pretty amazing, and thank you guys. Amanda Tulloch down at Hukanui Sports Horses, the enthusiasm that woman has is just really, really infectious, and she didn't hesitate to get on board also. And Abby Hoare and family, and from Beaumont Station, and big thanks to them also. I want to give you a quick story, and there's a moral to it. Have I got time? Thank you. So when it was finalised, these two fine people were coming to New Zealand, and when I decided to have the seminar at home, I got stuck in and tidied the place up, and spent probably 5 or 6 weeks mowing the bloody drive and spraying and weed eating and getting grumpy, and that's why I thank my wife. And then also got stuck in and cleaned up the house and tidied the house and bedrooms and did everything right. So Emma comes out in the morning and says, "Guess what?" And I said, "What's that?" She said, "Do you know what was on my bed last night?" And I said, "No." And she said, "A cat poo." Right in the middle of the bed. And I just... But now I'm going to get to the moral of the story. It's no matter how much you prepare, In the end, something out of control is going to make it turn to shit. And so now I'd like to introduce these two fine people. Emma and Michael. Emma from Sweden and Michael from Ireland. And out of the 10,000 people that, or guests, that breed horses around the world, there's probably 10,000 experts. And so why did I pick these two? It all came down to authenticity. And after spending 10, 12 years in this industry, the old bullshit monitor sort of starts working pretty well. And I believe that these guys aren't bullshit and that they're completely authentic, and the way they have shared their knowledge has actually completely proved me right. And so put your hands together for Michael and Emma. You guys like to introduce yourselves from here and get me the hell out of the way?
Thank you so much, Ewen. That was really nice, except for the cat poo, though. Well, I'm just amazed and honored how many of you that turned up here today. Because we were told that perhaps 20-ish people would come up here. It was the same at Ewen's, actually, and you just come out here and you're at least the double amount of people, I think. And we didn't expect that, but we were so happy that you're here. And we'd had this whirlwind tour around New Zealand, and we met the most amazing people. We've seen, I guess Ewen tried to lower our expectations before coming here, but the horses we've seen, I mean, a lot of them have at least or even better quality than we can find in Europe too. So perhaps you're not that far away as Ewen tried to put it to us when he asked us to come. So it's been great, and this will be a nice round-off to our trip. And Ewen introduced me, so I'm Emma Thorén Hellsten. Michael tells me I have to change that because it's impossible to pronounce in English. But this is actually not my first time in New Zealand. I was in New Zealand more than 20 years ago. I worked at the Thorén Stud, and I also went around backpacking, as you do when you're young. So there are some pictures from Wanaka and one from Wahiki Island, because of course when you come as a horse person you have to go riding, right? And I also did some interesting experiences when it comes to how you guys handle stuff. It's quite laid back, or it was 20 years ago at least, at the Thoroughbred Stud, the way you did like surgery in a paddock like that, the mare grazing beside it. Like, that was a great idea. I still haven't come that far in Sweden though, but still going into clinics and lots of stress. But yeah, that was a nice experience. I would have been brought up on a dairy farm, or not only dairy, sheep, chickens, everything you can breed almost, and a lot of horses. But I was very interested in breeding, and as I bred chickens and sheep and other also horses, I realized that there is something behind it, and I wanted to learn more. So I went to university into animal science, and especially into genetics. And one thing led to the other, and I made my PhD in genetics, and more specifically in international genetic evaluation of sport horse stallions, in a project that was called Interstallion, that some of you might have heard about. And from there I went on to the Swedish Warm Blood Association, and I was their breeding manager for about 14 years. So I stopped working there in February this year to proceed as a freelance consultant in breeding and genetics. During my time at the Swedish Warm Blood Association, I was also involved in the World Breeding Federation, first in this Interstallion project, but I also then was one of the co-founders of their scientific committee, working with issues like the fragile foal syndrome, like genomic evaluation, all sorts of genetics and statistics and research that could be interesting for the breeding industry. So that would be my passion, to be a kind of bridge between science and practical breeding, because both of those are my passion, and that's where I want to be. During my time as a breeding manager for the Swedish Warmblood, I also started a podcast, but it was in Swedish, so sorry you guys can't go in and listen to it. Well, you can. It's a Swedish person here. And we covered a lot of subjects for breeders, like the basics, also interviews with breeders. We would have people talking about parasites, all sorts of stuff that are useful for breeders. And we did about 50 episodes, I think, in total. But sometimes you don't have time to do the podcasts. And then I, like Jenny and like Ewen, I found Michael's podcast. And I thought it was great. So I thought, this is something that our Swedish breeders should listen to as well. So we invited Michael to come on our podcast to introduce him for the Swedish breeders. And we got a pretty good connection there. So we kept on having contact, and shall I tell the story or you tell the story? Yeah. Then this spring, when I started working independently, I thought I was going to Ireland for another job, and I thought it would be a good thing to get into one of Michael's breeders group that he will tell you about later and see how he works, because as I understood it, he'd had a really good way of getting people to interact with each other and for breeders to come together. So I asked Michael if I could come and sit in on one of those breeders meetings. And he said, of course you can. Why don't you give a speech while you're at it? And I did, and it worked out really well, and it was fun working together. So I guess I was in the back of his mind when Ewen called Michael. Did you tell the story? No, you didn't. Oh, you should have. But that story is up to you. Ewen called Michael multiple times in the middle of the night in New Zealand, and wanted Michael to come here. But Michael was hesitant. I don't know why. Because when I went to see Michael in April, he said, well, this guy from New Zealand keep calling me and want me to go down there, and I'm not sure I should. I know. And I, what are you waiting for? Like, just go. I've been to New Zealand. I love New Zealand, and go to New Zealand, talk about horse breeding. What better could it be like? But I guess since he didn't want to come down, Ewen kept asking for someone else. Perhaps if he knew of someone else that could come down here, someone interested in breeding. I don't know how specific you are. And you were talking also about the Swedish results in the in the Olympics. And Michael thought, well, I think I know just the person. And now we're here. So that's the story for you. He can probably elaborate on it. I'm a bit shorter when I talk. I don't know if it's an Irish thing or not. So that's the reason why we're here. So going into breeding, I have a couple of quotes here from John R. Gaines. Perhaps some of you would know of him as a very, very, very good thoroughbred breeder in the States. You know of him? He founded Gainesway Farm, and they would have bred those legendary racehorses as Blushing Groom, Liffard, and he also founded the Breeders' Cup in America. So he said that the genetic truth is not always the commercial truth. So that's one thing we're going to talk about. He also said that if you try to look beyond the sire and the dam in a pedigree, you're just kidding yourself. You can throw the rest of the pedigree away. A horse can only inherit from its sire and its dam, and that's where the genes come from. So I would have thought that with that, he doesn't mean that you shouldn't look into the pedigree of a horse, and it's not that you shouldn't care about pedigree, but when you breed, you should breed of the horses that perform themselves. And of course, if you can get hold of a full sister or a sibling to a horse that performed really well, it's better than to breed to any horse. But I don't know if you know, but when you look at your children, for example, they could be very different from each other, even if they have exactly the same parents. So from a genetic point of view, full siblings could actually have 100% of the genes in common, but they can also have 0% of the genes in common. It depends on what combination you get, and most often, of course, you get somewhere in between. But that means you will not be sure that a full sister would breed as good as the one that did the performance itself. And the closer you get to the performance, the bigger is the chance that you will actually transmit it as well. I'm going to go into some major trends that I think is present in Europe, in European breeding. And I'd be happy to answer any questions or discuss with you. So anytime you would like to fill in or ask something, just raise your hand or start talking, right? So my first theme would be freedom of choice. Stud books it's an old thing, right? And it's been established for more than 100 years, and for some breeds, several hundred years. And the stud books have done a lot of good things, and they have united breeders in those times. I feel that today breeders have started to choose stud book by the service or the products that they can provide, rather than that they would like to stick to a certain breed, which is natural, because today most breeds, warm bloods breed, would mix together, and we're all using the same bloodlines, the same stallions all over the world. So why not choose then the stud book that can provide the best service? In the same time, stud books then started to compete against each other over breeders, because they want the membership fee, they want the brand. And somewhere there they became very protective, like it's our data we shouldn't share, which would then not benefit the breeders. And it's not that I think stud books is a bad thing. I've been a breeding manager for 14 years, and I think they still do great things. But when it comes to data and sharing data, I think the way stud books work is not very modern, and it's not to benefit for the breeders. You would see that private companies are realizing this as well, going into the market by collecting data and providing data to breeders all over. One of them is Hippomundo, that Michael would talk about. Another one is Horsetelex, and you have several of those international databases, more or less, who provide their service more or less for free, and where we can have bonus information if you register. Something else that I think has to do with freedom of choice are the shortest stallion performance tests that you will see in almost all stud books today. You know, when they started with the stallion performance tests in Germany long ago, you had the 100-day test, or even longer for the seller stud, for example. You'd had 50, 70-day tests, and today they're getting shorter and shorter, because stallion owners wouldn't put their stallion through a very long test if there are other tests available that would mean that they could get their stallion back faster, or that they are more in control of the process of stallion performing. So the way it is in Germany today, some of you would probably know that a stallion doesn't even have to require a minimum score to pass the test. It's enough if he goes through the test without stopping it, like from veterinary reasons or something like that. I think it's one German stud book that has put a lowest score on it, but it's really important to know that's the development. Is not just to see that a stallion has passed, you have actually to look into what scores did he get, what description did he get, to know if it's a quality stallion. And going into description, do you know about linear scoring? How many of you have heard about linear scoring? 1? 2? Okay, linear scoring is then not scoring from a 1 to 10 scale. It's a grading from long to short, wide to narrow. In terms of jumping, does it fold its legs under itself, or do they keep the legs up? All of those things. It's describing the horse on a scale which would not be like a numerical scale. Some stud books use letters, some use cross. But it's to tell more about the character of the horse than saying if it's good or bad. And it's been used for a very long time with cattle, for example. And it's a very powerful tool, because then you can actually go in there and see So what does this stallion produce, and how would that suit my mare? Because you can have a stallion that would have scored 10 at the stallion performance test for jumping, and a mare that scored 8, but the offspring wouldn't come out and score 9, right? Or it could, but that's not the way it works. You would need to be more specific than that. And that's where those descriptive, the linear description and the descriptive breeding values are very useful tools. Yeah, I would say also with the stallion selection, while stallion selection actually, the requirements to get this approval status gets lower and lower, we see the opposite development when it comes to the mares. You would know about embryo transfer, and as I understand it, is fairly common in New Zealand. As an example, we had for the Swedish warm blood the head of the Keros Embryo Transfer Centre in Belgium coming over 10 years ago and talking about embryo transfer for the Swedish breeders. And at that time, he told us that in the Belgian warm blood stud book there would be 1,000 foals each year registered that were embryo transfer foals. And they did not do embryo transfer with the inferior mares, right? They only did embryo transfer with the superior mares. And Jenny, you have heard this already because I told that Ewen's. So look at, now in the stud book, they registered in total 3,000. So that would have been 1/3 of the foals coming out of superior mares. And the impact that had on the quality of the Belgian warm blood stud book. Now, when you look in the Olympics or the World Championships, which is the most represented stud book? Belgian warm blood. And they were the ones to start this. So that's what happened when they upscaled on the mare side. So you have kind of the opposite development on the mare side, on the stallion side. But what you do have to do as a breeder is that you have to be aware of it, and you have to look at what you're doing. And also with this development on the mare side, it pushes the inbreeding, because then the offspring will be more related not only on the stallion side but also on the mare side. It's not that it's not bad yet, but you have to keep an eye on it and be aware of it. Right. Another thing that we see is that stud books that used to be closed, like the Holsteiner stud book, for example, are opening up. That also has to do with freedom of choice. It also has to do with inbreeding, because they had great inbreeding problems. But also that it's difficult to keep this loyalty from breeders today. And we have even crossbreeding stud books starting up in Europe. The latest example that I can think of is a stud book in France crossing Lusitanos with warm blood stallions to produce a dressage horse. So that's an experiment so far, and I wouldn't call it a stud book because they're not aiming to consolidate. They're aiming to produce a product for dressage. So it's a more commercial interest, but it's still called a stud book, and it's a member of the World Breeding Federation. And I think that's pretty much how you define a stud book today. If you can become a member of the World Breeding Federation, then you're a recognized stud book. So next theme is breeding for health. That we have a development where more facts and new tools become available all the time. Research is going fast when it comes to genetics. And one example would be that the researchers find more and more genes that are responsible for genetic defects. Like you would have heard about the fragile foal syndrome, formerly the warm blood fragile foal syndrome. And as this develops, we will know about more and more genetic defects. And when the first ones turned up, some people were like, "Oh, we have to get rid of this because it's really bad, right? If you get one." But the more and more genetic defects that turn up, the more difficult it will be to actually exclude those horses from the population. So their strategy now would be to not ban the carriers from breeding, but not cross the carriers so that you don't get the disease. And that applies to monogenic defects that are just caused by one mutation in one gene. And if you have any questions about those specific defects, we can talk about that later, but just some examples of what have been found in the recent years. We also have this case of osteochondrosis, and that's then not a defect that's dependent on one mutation in one gene. That would be multiple genes that are responsible for osteochondrosis, and thereby the environment is also very, very important for the development or non-development of osteochondrosis. But there are research being done on osteochondrosis, and Ewen?
What is it?
Oh, sorry, osteochondrosis. It's a defect in the cartilage. You have to help me with English if I'm, So when the horse is growing, OCD, but we call it osteochondrosis now because OCD would be when you have like the bone fragments. But the disease is actually more complex than that, so you can get like defect surface in the joint, but not necessarily the shape. But you can see that there's a flattening, or it's just the quality of the cartilage that is impaired, and it would be due to the same, it would have the same genetic background, but it's not manifested in the same way. So some stud books do a grading it's on osteochondrosis, but you have it on a scale from 1 to 5. So 5 would be the worst with like fragments in the joint. Clear enough? Yeah. So you cannot today make a gene test and say that this horse is a carrier or this is a non-carrier, because there are so many genes involved and also the environment. What is going on is that KWPN, they have started doing breeding values for it. So it's by statistical measures, x-raying a lot of horses. And in that way, they can kind of find out which ones would have a genetic backpack that makes them more prone to deliver offspring that would be more sensitive to the environment and thereby get more osteochondrosis. So that's developed, and Germany is catching up with KWPN, and they would also, the Dutch will also sell tests, gene tests for this, which would say if your horse, what breeding value your horse would have for this. But that's only applicable for the KWPN horse, not for horses from other populations, and then that depends on how much related they are. So if you have a horse that's by a KWPN stallion, it could be relevant for you, otherwise not. So as you see, there's a lot happening. The French are doing research on it. They have really high demands on stallions in Belgium. I think there are some projects going on in Ireland, some X-ray screening scheme for mares. And why this is relevant for you is that it's really a commercial thing. Of course, it's important for every individual, if it's affected or not, but also because it's really difficult to sell those horses that are the most affected. And you can improve it by breeding. Even if it takes generation, you can improve it. And that's what some stud books have done. Like the Belgians, for example, 30 years ago, they had so much osteochondrosis, but they could not sell those horses on a large scale. And getting every horse surgery, if you look at it on population level, it's really expensive. So they did create this program, and they started. The Belgians actually have the highest requirements of all stud books when it comes to osteochondrosis. So today it's much better, but it takes some generations. Question?
Like, if you've got a mare with an OCD, would you breed from it and make sure you picked a stallion that was hopefully clear? Or would you go, like, it was a 5, I wouldn't breed from it, but if it was a 1, you would? Like, on the scale?
If it was a 5, I would not breed from her. If it was lower, it depends on what performance she has. If she's a high performer, then I should breed from her. I could breed from her with a stallion that I know is not heavily affected, and see what comes out of it. Because science doesn't know yet. Some horses can look really bad, but they still go on and perform, and seems like they are unaffected. And some other horses would look quite fine, actually, but be heavily affected in terms of performance. So I think it all comes down to performance. You should have a breeding program for the breed or the population that encourages people to breed for sounder horses. And on the individual level, you always have to look at the performance on the horse and if it's sound or not. That's my opinion. You know what? I think we should let in some more air. Just stretch our legs for like 2 minutes, because I think it's not much oxygen left in here, right? So just stand up, walk around your chair, let some air in, and then we go on. That's actually one of the, I think, intentions of us coming here. Also, you meeting up with each other. Right. Feel a little bit better? Refreshed? Great. So, how can research in new technologies become an asset for horse breeding? We've all been through COVID, and I know that New Zealand have had a worse time than most when it comes to confinement. The opposite to Sweden, actually, even if we too were confined. But during this time, like, hard times are also times that creates new inventions, right? So what's happened during COVID, it's already started before, but what happened during COVID was that digital assessment of horses have become more common. Before that, if you would tell like a Swedish warm-blood judge that we should do a digital assessment of a horse, they would just refuse. That's not possible. And it's, of course, it's not the same as seeing the horse in live, but it is possible to do something. And in a country like Sweden, it's very long, elongated, the distances are very far. You don't want to go with a foal like of 5-6 hours to get it assessed, right? So they're actually useful with digital assessment. There are also both stud books, but also private stakeholders that use this technology as a service to the breeders that use their stallions. One example would be GFE. Now, I'm not working with the GFE. I have nothing to do with them, but I think it's a good example where they have used the technology, so breeders can actually. There are the requirements on their web page. You should do like this and this and this. Take photo from this angle, this size of photo. Take this video, and you can send it in to them and get your mare assessed, and then they choose from their stallion which stallion would be the most suitable. And they're basing it on this kind of linear description, as I told you about before. So that's the tool. The use of AI is coming also. Maybe it's not so much yet in the traditional stud books, but we have a lot of research in France going on, putting accelerometers on horses, putting those small dots on them, and then using the computer to put everything together. And what they're trying to do now is to see are there any measures that are correlated to competition results that we can use, because that's what's so difficult with horse breeding, right? That we don't have much of the objective measures that you do have in cattle breeding or sheep breeding or any of the production animals. We mostly have this subjective scoring of horses. It would be great if we could just get some of those objective measures into horse breeding. Then we have the genomic breeding values that's been around for a long time for the cattle. But as it turns out, it seems like those linear scores, the linear scores are very much more suitable for genomic breeding values than the evaluating ones. The descriptive, they are more objective, and there is quite a few research projects going on who are looking at targeting specific areas on the genome, which are then responsible for conformation traits, jumping traits. There's a Swedish project where they found correlations between specific areas on the genome and temperament of horses, for example, if they're tensed or not, and also for some jumping traits. And this is really interesting research. The KWPN have already published genomic breeding values. Problem is with genomic breeding values that you would need so much data as a basis for it to make relevant breeding values that are reliable. And it's actually more than one stud book, even the biggest stud book could produce. Like the cattle, they've done it worldwide, and that's the amount of data you would need for years to get the good breeding values. And if the stud books won't cooperate, there is nothing behind that. You can publish breeding values, but they are not reliable. The KWPN have produced them, but they're heavily criticized because the breeders don't think that they represent what they see with their eyes. So the old breeding values that are just statistics would be more relevant right now to the breeders because they think they can actually see what the breeding values tells them. But I think that over time, the genomic breeding values will be very useful for us. And also, that goes hand in hand with the new technology for pedigree control. You know, you take DNA to see the parentage of the horse. But this new technology called SNPs, that would be single nucleotide polymorphism. And this is DNA for you. And what you do in, it's difficult with the table, but can you see that there are letters? So microsatellites would be take a whole chunk of DNA and compare it between parents, but the single nucleotide polymorphism, that's so hard to pronounce, that would be taking just a pair of letters and do it on multiple spots, like thousands of spots in the DNA, and compare it between parent and offspring. And while you're at it, you can also test for diseases, performance, if you know the genes for the performance, for color, for example. So you can do so much more than just parentage testing in the same time. So this technology, most stud books in Europe are currently switching to this technology. So Germany, Holland, France is doing it now. I hope Swedish Warmblood will do it very soon. So if you're going into parentage testing or mandatory parentage testing or something like that, make sure you start out with the new technology straight ahead. Because also the old technique with the microsatellites, it's not transferable. So if you would get, say you import a stallion to New Zealand and you would like to parentage test for his progeny, and you have got the microsatellite technique, but the stallion is tested on the SNPs, you would have to redo the test in New Zealand to get the microsatellite profile. And that's not worth the money, perhaps, if you can get the SNPs that are a little bit more expensive, but where you can also get so much more out of it. Right. So, what's hot on the Swedish market? Might not be relevant to you guys, but the more we travel around and the more we hear, I think it's the same situation in New Zealand as it is worldwide, actually. We get more and more specialized competition horses for show jumping and dressage, and that drives the development towards top sport. More and more specialized individuals, better and better suited for top performance. But the questions everyone seems to be asking them today, is there a risk when you breed those extreme horses, like going too much towards the extremes? In show jumping, it seems to be the case all over the world that not everyone, a lot of people want to use the old stallions, the proven ones that have performed in sport. And that would actually mean that the development is slower than on the dressage side, where almost only the young stallions are used. And you see this enormous genetic progress. Sometimes it might be too fast if you don't know what you're doing. I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but I think you should try to get some balance in it. And the way that ICSI have driven the development towards only using those stallions that are 30 years or older. That would be the fathers of the top performance horses right now. It's kind of dangerous too, because if you look 10 years or 15 years from now, or you look 10 or 15 years back from now, which ones were the top sires then? It's not the same ones as it is today, right? And development has become even faster, especially with the embryo transfer using the mare side. So the stallions that are the top producers today, one thing you could be fairly sure of is that those stallions will not be the top performing stallions pedigree-wise in 10 or 15 years. They will still produce good horses. They are proven, they produce quality horses, but they will not be in top of the world rankings, right? With the specialization also, what we get in Sweden, and I know they're getting it all over Europe, and what I've heard from here is that sometimes there will be problem with temperament. Are they only suitable for the professional riders? Some of them would suit both, but this is something you have to take into consideration, and I think it's possible, but I think it's difficult to do both. And perhaps you have to decide on what to do, because if you want to do both in an extensive way, I think you will miss out on the top horses, or you will only get horses that are suitable for the top riders. And if you don't have that many top riders, after a few generations, everyone will be riding, I don't know, in New Zealand, Clydesdales perhaps. In Sweden, they would be riding Icelandic horses. But, question?
Can you expand on temperament? Because it's very difficult to get information about temperament of stallions, especially if you're using frozen or overseas. You have to make an absolute guess at it.
That's it. I think there is very little information on temperament, and that same problem everywhere, and also that's why it's so difficult to breed from it. If you go out and have a look at a showground, and you look at the offspring, and you go to the warm-up arena, then you will, after a while, get a good picture of the temperament of the offspring of the stallions, right? But then there are also the young stallions. You don't know yet what their offspring are like. They're not out there. And also there could be that it's only the best temperamented horses that get out to competition. So even if you see crazy horses in competition, they're still in competition. And those that are worse, they are not there anymore. But there have been quite a few projects trying to define or try to measure temperament. And I'm actually involved in a project right now for the Swedish Warm Blood Association. I'm not saying that we will succeed. Of course, I hope so. We're making a great effort to measure temperament. But it's so much variations, and it's so important to try to find the part of the temperament that is inheritable, and not only the thing that's affected by the environment. So we're working with ethologists, geneticists, experienced judges, others, and we're doing this long term. And we've been at it 3 years already, and it's really slow because no one wants to finance it. But I think if we could get there and at least get some of the traits, it would be a huge benefit for breeders and riders alike, because you can use it both as a description of the horse for the horse buyers, but then hopefully also get some heritable traits so you can see if you can breed for it. And then it would also be easier to find stallions that put both performance and good temperament into their offspring.
Do you think the temperament has got better over the years because of the difficulty of the courses have been more adjustable and things, I guess?
Well, breeders are the best in looking into the future, I think. You have, as a good breeder, you have to know before the riders do what's the next level, right? And the sport's been changing, so we're going into those more reactive, quicker, more sensitive horses. But if you ask someone who was riding in the 70s, I was not there, so I wouldn't know. But they actually say that back then the horses were more stupid, and they were harder to cooperate with. So it's not only bad, but it's different. And I would have said that in Sweden, we've probably lost about 2 generations of sport horses being so sensitive and reactive, so they actually been wrongly ridden. Do you understand what I'm getting at? They get injured, they get frustrated, you have all sorts of problems, and those people usually end up at the vets, and it's something wrong with this horse, but it's not something wrong with the horse, it's wrong with the rider. But also that it's sad that we lose so many horses, but over time the riders have also learned how to ride them, and perhaps that was a necessary development. It's very sad for those horses that had to die, which they had, but it's also helped the development. So I think that as breeders look into the future and see the next step, if you're lucky, but also if you're not lucky, you will end up losing some of your top horses because the development of the sport is not right there. But if you are a good breeder, you will get the payback because you will also have the best horses in the end. Is that an answer to your question?
Yeah, it's like, you have to have a horse that shortens, lengthens really quickly. So a horse with a bad temperament can't have the ability to do this, because it's too preoccupied with other things. So if you've got a horse at top sport, like we get it all the time, is that you breed in for the top end of the sport, but for them to get to the top end of the sport, they have to have trainability, they have to be biddable. Otherwise, they're not going to make it to the top end of the sport, and that's what we hear quite a lot. It's you breed in Ferraris, but they have to be biddable horses to get to the top end of the sport.
I totally agree with that.
A question around the rankings that are used internationally. Are the rankings all presently performance-based rankings, or are there indexes that incorporate other traits?
Only performance-based. So the PhD project I did would have been preparatory to do the index thing and to include other traits than just performance. What happened was that from the beginning it was the World Breeding Federation that decided on doing it with the Interstallion Committee, and it was Germany, Holland, Denmark, Sweden, France, Belgium doing it. Halfway the Germans and the Dutch pulled out because they did not want the transparency, to be frank. Now it sounds like I'm making it up, but they were pretty blunt with it because it was this protectionism of data. We won't give you the data because they would like to protect their stallion owners. Of course, some of their stallions would have been ranked low, but I think actually most of them would have had a positive effect. And there was a second attempt of doing it just 3 years ago. The World Breeding Federation launched this project again, and I was part of it then again. And we started off fine, and everyone was very enthusiastic, going through, sending round questionnaires for the statistics from the different stud books. And what happened when we had done that and started on data, Germany and Holland pulled off again. So I don't think we will see breeding values that are relevant on the performance. But it turns out it's much easier for the stud books to cooperate when it comes to the linear scores because they are not good or bad, right? So we will probably see, if I'm just having a guess now, but I'd say we'd have the international descriptive breeding values before we get the evaluating ones. Then stallion ranking in terms of performance that you have now, do you know how it's done? Yeah, so the World Breeding Federation makes a ranking which is based on the 6 best horses from each stud book. It's not bad, but you can see the difference between a stud book that has 14,000 foals a year than a stud book that has 3,000 foals a year or 1,000 foals a year. It's quite difficult to get 6 top horses with top riders to be sound and healthy if you just produce 1,000 foals a year compared to if you have 14,000 foals a year. So that's the weak point with the World Breeding Federation ranking. Then Horse Telex have another ranking, which I actually think is better because it relates to the size to the number of offspring entered into the system. And you have the Hippomundo ranking, which is based on prize money, right? And then it takes into account not only the 6 best. You can rank horses in different ways in the Hippomundo. So you can choose to take the average, for example, average prize money, which would be more interesting than just the total amount of prize money. Then the difficulty with prize money is that it doesn't always reflect the quality of the competition. It reflects how good you are in finding sponsors for your competition. So, to be blunt. So there are all kinds of ranking out there, but I think none of them so far is really good. But if you look at all of them, you can still see which one is coming out on top of it for every ranking. And you can, both Horse Telex and Hippomundo, it's interesting because you can actually look at an age group of stallions to see who's up and coming and who's, it's really interesting that way because you can do your own selection a bit, have a look at it. And those tools, of course, they are available to you as well as anyone in Europe. So in that way, you're nowhere remote. You can have the same look at it as everyone else.
Something that was discussed at Ewen's that might be relevant to the trends and how you were saying with the dressage breeders, they tend to go to the younger stallions, whereas the jumping breeders that are breeding purely for commercial purposes to sell at auctions and that are going to the big name stallions maybe of the past. Will you just talk at it from a genetic progress point of view in terms of what happens with older stallions and older mares in terms of what they breed? Because I think it might be helpful.
So what happens when you have these extreme cases where you use only young ones or only old ones. From an individual point of view, it might be not be a huge difference depending on how superior a stallion is compared to his what do you say, the other ones born the same year. Like we had, for example, Cadento coming into Sweden. It was a long time ago now, but he would still be like one of the absolute top producers in Sweden because he was so genetically superior to the others. But in terms of population, if you have a breeding progress in your population, and most stud books do today, and not a small one, a big one, then it would be more reliable to use like any approved young stallion, because from a population point of view, that would be the genetically superior animal, than to use an old one, because that one is already, say, surpassed. So, of course, there is a huge variation among the young ones, but if you constantly keep using the young ones, as they do in the dressage breeding, you will speed up the genetic progress. And that's the same thing that as you do with the embryo transfer technology with the mares. Right? Was that what you wanted?
Just, you might touch it, like there's been studies done before about the older stallions and the qualities.
Yeah, that's right. So, and you can have a go at the mares afterwards. But there actually have been studies that have looked at the age of the top stallions when they produced their best crops. Would you have a guess at it? Old? 5, 6, 8, 4. Sorry? 4-year-old. Yeah, it's actually between 4 and 6. And that's not every stallion, but it's a lot of them. So that's just a way of saying the same thing, that every new generation in general becomes better than the past one. And do you want to tell about the mares now, or do you do it during your talk?
The other thing to mention, I have little to no knowledge of the thoroughbred sector, but there have been studies done on thoroughbred stallions as well. I think it was the University of Limerick in Ireland did a study on when thoroughbred stallions produce their best offspring, and this is on average, obviously there are outliers, and somebody could stand up and say, well, this horse produced the best when he was 20. We're not looking for outliers, we're talking as a whole, as a population, as a sector, as a international industry. They did a study that showed it was showing as the age of these thoroughbred stallions was increasing, their strike rate was decreasing. It's just something to consider if you are breeding for the long term and not breeding for auctions. And it's not that you have to go all extreme, but just maybe keep it in the back of your mind. On the mare's side, something that I had talked about at Ewen's, and is that sometimes when I was trying to figure out this whole thing, I was looking to the thoroughbreds, and I was studying different thoroughbred books, thoroughbred breeding theories and principles, and something that I read one day just as a throwaway comment in a book, just pretty much a one-liner, was that the majority of winning racehorses, like top winning racehorses, were bred as the first 3 or 4 foals from their dams. And I thought this was a massively significant comment to only be given a one-liner in a book. It should have been given a book. And I was wondering why I'd never heard anybody talking about this in the sport horse industry. Obviously, I think there are probably maybe a few more variables in the sport horse industry. So I decided to run this with the sport horse industry. I tried the top 10 Irish bred horses at the time in show jumping. 10 out of 10 were first 4 foals. I tried the top 10 in the world at the time. 9 out of the 10 were. I was thinking, this is a bit freaky. So, and I had invested in a few older mares at the time, so I was probably getting nervous. So then I, myself and a friend, and it'll tell you what our social lives are like, we went back and we looked at the previous 20 years of medalists, individual medalists at the Olympic Games, World Championships, European Championships, probably Nations Cup finals, World Cup finals, 7-year-olds Young Horse World Championship finals. So all the medalists, and a very, very, very high percentage of them were born within the first 4 foals. It's not that it's not that the dams never went on to produce good horses again. But we were just looking at that. The other thing to throw out, because of course it is relevant, every brood mare, every mare who has a foal, obviously at least has 1. So there are more mares that have 1 foal than there are that have 2, 3, 4, 5. Obviously you have to run that, and that was beyond my intellectual capabilities. I didn't run that, but it was just, again, it seems to play out on both the mares and the stallions. So I expected probably to see that they were all born out of really young mares, but there were ones that were born out of maybe older mares that had competed, but there's probably different things to consider. And I think a lot of them, what I was actually surprised at as well, was the fact that, I don't know what it's like here, but at home, a lot of the time people often talk down or speak negatively of their first foals, and they're nearly they're partially discarded sometimes. Maybe they're a bit small or they're a bit whatever, and people are kind of excusing, oh, it's just the first foal. But a large portion of championship medalists were first foals, and in some cases their mother might have been bred as a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old. There was a lot. I think in general it's going to be younger mares, but there are mares that had produced first 4 foals that were older mares, maybe that had competed in the sport or something like that. But you'd be able to say, I'd say, better from a genetic point of view rather than me and my sad life and in the evenings.
When did that become relevant?
It's not genetic.
And it's not genetic, right? Well, I think that, yep.
This is really interesting. So, if you put an embryos into recip mares, is it the environmental factor, or do you think it's actually because the mare is obviously carrying the foal? So, if you put like, is it relevant in the selection of sort of recipient mares, so you actually have a mare that has 3 foals, and then after the 4th foal or the 5th foal, you get rid of the recipient mare?
Well, I actually talked to your very good vet you have down here, Lee Morris. So there are studies, I think, done on this as well. But I think there are 2 aspects of this. One is the physiology part of it, and the other is genetic. So in terms of breeding progress, you would like a fairly young mare, and of course from a performance pedigree and with some performance herself. And then is the physiology part, where Lee said that there are evidence supporting this, that using the young mares, because their placenta is more fresh. I wouldn't be a vet, I don't know those stuff, but you obviously have a very knowledgeable vet in this country that's more knowledgeable.
It's to do with the nutrient transfer from the placenta across to the foal, and as the mare gets older, it sort of increases and then it decreases. So you've got more allowance of nutrients across. So is there any sort of way that somebody's going to actually look at this? Because I think this is quite relevant.
I think there is research going on, like from veterinary science, but I wouldn't know as a geneticist. Yes, but that's another thing. The character of the recipient mare. We could go into this with embryo transfer, like how important it is to, one, have a good character of the mare, because we talked about temperament before, and temperament testing or description of temperament, and a lot of the temperament would actually be something where the foal takes after its mother. Attitude towards other horses, attitude towards humans, how spooky they are, but then other parts of the temperament would be like performance parts of the temperament would be more inherited traits, like how they react in front of the fence, how clever they are in terms of jumping, and all those things, although we haven't described them yet. And then I think you should actually do this again and do it with some good vets that are knowledgeable in this, because this is actually not my or Michael's area of expertise, so we can have a good guess at it, but it's not fact, and I'm all into facts. So do that, but what we do know is that from previous experiences that you should use a mare who's as much like the biological mare, the biological mother as possible in terms of size, in terms of blood, as much alike as possible. Cold blood mares are not good. Thoroughbred mares are not good in terms of warm blood breeding. You should use something that's very much like the biological mother. Standard breds have been used extensively in Sweden and worked really well, as long as you find the ones that are similar to the warm bloods. Okay. So something that Ewen asked me specifically to talk about is what paved the way for the Swedish success. And it's been an amazing year. It's beyond our dreams, I think, what's happened to the Swedish show jumping. And I wish I could say that the success depends on the progress in the Swedish warm blood breeding only, but that's not, of course, not the case. So it's so much more complex than that, and it has not been a straight road to success. I would have said that it started in the early 80s, where some people came together at a meeting like this, but the issue was, how do we change Swedish show jumping, because it was so bad. The horses could not jump. The young horse development was inferior. We had no good competitions. It was really bad. And all those things had to change. And it has not been a straight roads, and we have had so many quarrels, disputes. So it's not that it's been like, wow, now we're going together and we'll unified go towards the goal and we win the Olympics. It's not been like that. It's been very much the other way around. But still it worked, because it kind of triggered everyone to do their best in their department. So breeding has become much better due to just people being aware of producing show jumpers and not just horses. We have imported lots of semen. First batches were perhaps not that good, like in terms of what suited the Swedish mares, but in time people have learned. Also for this specific team, I mean, it's not that we have a lot of those riders. We are still a pretty small nation, But it's an excellent team in terms of all functions, and not at least, I would say, the mental training program that was put into place by the Swedish Olympic Committee. So the Swedish riders and those and some more that were selected have been able to follow this mental training program for years. And I know that they all, when you talk to them and they're being interviewed on how to make success, not only to be successful, but to be the best, this have had a huge role in their development. Because it also helped them to handle pressure, which I think you saw they did it in an excellent way, both in the Olympics and the World Championships. It's about performing under pressure, and especially Peter, who came in second in the Olympics, the Olympics before that, came in second, and he just went home and thought, never again. If I'm doing this one more time, I'm going to win. And he just went all in for the mental training, and also he's been counting the strides and the time. So he's been working with Peter Eriksson, who was in the Athens Olympics. He was riding Cadento. He's an expert in the shortcuts. So it's all very thought through. And the riders now are not the riders that they used to be. You know, they would go to the pub and have a few pints when at competitions, and they would not treat themselves as athletes. But I think that the Swedish Olympic Committee and the atmosphere in the sport has been able to change that. So the riders are not now working as athletes. They are sound. They are training themselves in all aspects, like in terms of what they eat and how they train and compensatory training. So it's all thought through. And you can see that simmering down, not only for the top riders, because those riders all become the role models for the others, right? So the things they do, the younger ones want to do as well. So it's really important with the role models. So it's not, there are no like simple explanations, but I think it's been working on all areas in the same time. And there are no government funding for this in Sweden, and not in breeding, not for anything else. So everything is like private or people putting their own money into this. So it can very well be that in 4 years this is all gone because no one wanted to invest in it anymore. But one huge sponsor that's been, I think, influential in this is H&M, they found Malin when she was 19, and she was at a show in Gothenburg International Horse Show, and they did this masquerade jumping, and it was not only that, but they saw her talent, and they've been sponsoring her ever since, so that she would be 47, 48 now. So they've actually been sponsoring her and had cooperation for over 20 years. And they found Peter a few years later, and the same thing there. So it's a long-term commitment and a long-term project, and they've been really committed to each other. And I think that's also a huge part of their success. Yeah, now when Malin and Peter, and as well as the other two, they would have been really good riders, even when they were younger. So everyone wants them to have their horses. So they get shown a lot of horses all the time. So for those people, that would not be a problem. It's more of a problem finding the time of going around and try out all those horses. They have people working with them that go out and try horses and who know what they like and so they can prioritize. But it's not only about finding the top horses for those people. I mean, what if Jannica, Henrik's wife, if she would not have become pregnant, Henrik would not have been riding King Edward, right? So there are all sorts of coincidences, but also a strategy behind it. I guess that's the best answer I can give to you. But in the team, in the World Championships, there was one Swedish warm blood. The other ones are actually imported. But what the breeding progress have done for the sport is that the level is like the genetic progress, like the level in total of the sport in Sweden, as well as the surfaces, the events, everything has increased. And then the more you got of that better quality, the bigger is your chance to get also the very top ones. So that's where breeding comes into the picture.
What about eventers? Is anyone breeding them?
No. Well, actually, the eventing riders in Sweden is very much like the families who do eventing, they breed eventers. But it's kind of hard for the eventers in Sweden because the show jumping sport is so big. So 70-75% of the sport would be show jumping. 30-35%, it's changing a bit, but it's dressage. And then the rest, which is almost nothing, is eventers. So 2 to 3% is a year of the horses that goes into the sport, or the starts that we have. And the way it's been in Europe, 2007 to 2012, the coverings were going down, and not little. It's been a 50% cut in coverings, which means that for a few years now there has been a severe shortage of sport horses. And then show jumping being the biggest sport with the most money, or not that there is money, a lot of money for the breeders in the sport, but the jumping riders would pay more for a horse than an eventer. So even if they would like to have the same horse, more or less, or at least some of them, the eventers would not have the money to buy that horse. It's much more money in the jumping sport in Sweden. So I think Sweden could breed good eventers, and there are some people doing it, especially one family, you know, the Algotssons with Vega, for example. They have a really good mare line coming from a thoroughbred mare. But they too sell to show jumping people, not all of their horses, but you have to, right, to get the means to continue. Mm.
Was there any commonality in the breeding of the Swedish show jumping horses that came from outside of Sweden? Was there any commonality in their breeding? Are they all from Germany? Or?
You're actually asking the right person because I studied this. Yeah, we had a look at all the imported semen and all the imported stallions, and it was from Germany, Holland, France. Not so many of them from France, but some influential stallions, mostly, and some from Denmark. And at that time, that would have been like 15, 17 years ago. It was the Holsteiners that would have had the best result on the Swedish warm blood population. Back then, the Holsteins was a closed stud book, and they had really high quality compared to the Swedish warm bloods, and they had consolidated bloodlines. The Swedish warm blood has always been an open stud book; it's never been closed. So it's more or less outbred as a breed. Of course, we have common traits, but not as the Holsteiners. So that would have been a good thing to import stallions that came from consolidated mare lines, and also, of course, had the desired traits. Next was France, which was a bit surprising because there is not many French stallions imported to Sweden, and Swedish riders and Swedish breeders tend not to like the French riding, and then French horses are bred for French riders and French riding, right? But that was the one came in second. I think that today would not be the same thing. I think the Holsteiners lost their position in terms of breeding and influence in the Swedish warm blood. So today the Belgians would be much more dominant. Yeah, but then the Belgians have bred with the same bloodlines as everywhere else. So they have the Holsteiners, they have French blood, they have this European mix, which we are soon having all of us, I think, in Europe. We have some specifics, but we're more or less interrelated all.
Show jumping breeders have had more time.
I would say they have been smart enough to use new technology. They are based, well, let's just proceed here. Right. So they have breeders now that know the sport. They are based in the middle of Europe, kind of, or at least in between Holland and Germany and France. And it's a very small country. So they could go, within an hour, they could go to a lot of shows. So they are there all the time, watching the sports, watching the horses at the warm-up. They know what to breed for. Another key factor would be young horse testing or competition with the central finals, because that's where breeders come together. That's where you have a lot of young horses coming together. So you can see common traits between related individuals. Also for the breeders, especially when in the beginning, the breeders would watch and see which one of the young horse producers are the most successful. And then after a while they could also see which ones were successful but at a cost, which horses did not make it even if they were talented, like they were too heavily produced. So that would also have created a selection among young horse producers. So having those young horse events is so good for the breeding, because you get people coming together, you can see so many horses at the same time, you can see so many people at the same time, and I would say that's one of the absolute key factors to be successful as a breeding nation, to have those young horse events. And also with time, I think most of the successful stud books also started competitions around, like for other horses, because that made the ones that were not breeding or producing but are their potential customers came to those competitions and they saw something they liked and they bought a horse. So they are really a key factor, and that comes into marketing and sales. I won't go into that. I think also it's time for Michael to talk now. I'm doing a lot of the talking today. But another thing that I think is very important is that to monitor the development and to evaluate what you do. And if it's needed, take another direction. And that's not possible if you do not, one, register the horses and make sure that you know what their pedigree is verified, so you actually know what you bred. Two, get all the data from the competitions or young horse tests if you have that, so you can actually follow what happens. Otherwise you're, in the dark. You don't know what you're doing. And then look at the big picture. As a breeder, it's easy to look at what you're producing yourself, but to become a successful breeding nation, you have to also look at the big picture. And knowledge transfer and network facilitation, and that's what you're doing here today, right? And that would also happen at the young horse competitions. And if you want to, you can add to that. You can have conferences or interesting speakers coming into those competitions where people already gathered. So to round off and have a look in the crystal ball. Now this is my opinions. This is not facts or truth, but this is what I think will happen. And I'll have to come back here in 10 years and we'll see if it's, or 20 years, and we'll see what happened. But I think that the private companies will take over the role of information collector or spreaders if the stud books don't step up their game like now. And that's Hippomundo, Horselect, GFE, and also others. I think the concept of stud book will disappear or become insignificant, because there are actually no such thing as breeds in the sport. Well, Holstein and Trakehner aside, but otherwise we are all aiming at the same international warm blood, right? I think that the stud books will have a role in the future as a spokespartner, and as someone in every country. It's important to have like a connection to government rules and everything, that they can help the breeders. But when it comes to data, I think that their role will be taken over by the private companies. I think we will see more and more of the tailored horses, like the purpose becomes more important than their name of the breed. Like I have a show jumper. I don't have a Holsteiner. I have a purpose-made leisure horse or whatever it is. Because also in the future you will have more and more specific genetic tools, so you can actually be able to target what you want much more specifically. In terms of threats, I think we will see more and more of the infectious diseases, not only for humans, but also for horses. So you will have to be aware of how to handle that. And I think all countries have to work on that. I know you're lucky in New Zealand, so you don't have a lot of that stuff that we have in Europe, and you're protected. But COVID still came here, right? So you never know when it strikes, and you should be prepared. We have the animal welfare issue, and I take it as I said now that it's threats. Of course, we're all concerned about animal welfare. We're not in this to harm our animals. But there are organizations and there are the public that sometimes find that what we do to the horses is harmful. And it's so easy that public opinion turns against you. And you would know much better than I do, but I heard Rowley, an FBI guy, talking about what happened to dog racing in Australia. So I don't know exactly what was the case, but public opinion turned against it, and in a few years it almost disappeared. And we have to take that into consideration in our sport as well, because it happens really quickly today. So being aware of that, I know that in Swedish horse communities, social media and everything, those people are often laughed at, or people are pecking at them because they're concerned, because they don't know anything about our sport anyway. That does not matter the day that the opinion turns against you. So even if you don't like it, you have to adapt. Otherwise you could be out in 2 or 3 years. Climate concerns. I'm not going to elaborate on if it's true or not, but the thing is that there are a lot of rules put into place that will affect us as a sport. Will we still be allowed to ship or have horses flying all over the globe? Will that be allowed in a few years, or will it be considered a climate threat? You never know the next thing that comes up as a rule to protect the environment, right? Also in terms of how you keep your horses. I know here we've learned so much about planting trees and carbon harvesting, and next thing it could be the horses. You never know. Political situation. We have a horrible war going on between Ukraine and Russia, affecting Europe heavily. And you would think it would affect the horse sport, but it will. When gas or diesel becomes very much more expensive, when horse feed become more expensive, all those things affect our sport as well, and makes the situation is changed. So when I look in the crystal ball, I think actually it will become more difficult with physical competitions all over the world. It's kind of crazy the thing we're doing now. We're shipping horses and riders around the globe. I think that might not be possible to such an extent in the future. But then we have all these AI and digital solutions, and I think the sport will still be there, and I don't know how the change will be, but I think there will be a change, because the way the trends are going now, I think it will change. And by that, I shall leave the word to the wordy Irishman for some entertainment and facts.
I might just have to swap over here, so just bear with me for a minute.
screen or anything like that on an app?
I have no idea.
It should just be.
Is that a Samsung TV?
Yeah.
It's asking for an AirPlay code. Oh, there we go. Thank you very much. Testing? Yeah, it's working. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Is that okay? Does that sound okay? Yeah. At the last talk, I had I had lost my voice in advance of the last talk, which isn't a good situation to be in when you fly to the other side of the world to give a talk. But thankfully, it's on the way back. We would have covered this the last day at Ewen's, but before I go on to talk about myself and my own perspectives, there's one person who hasn't been addressed so far. He spent his introduction addressing everyone else and what they have done, but today wouldn't be happening, or the last day wouldn't be happening, or we wouldn't be in this country except for the persistence of a certain individual. So before I go on to talk about this talk, I want to make sure that everyone shows their appreciation for Ewen and all that he has done. And I can talk a lot, so it's best for me that I sit down, I think, if that's okay. It's okay camera-wise, or... Perfect. So, yeah, as has been said, I got a call from an unknown New Zealand number, which I assumed was a spam call. And for some bizarre reason, I answered it. It turned out it was 2 o'clock in the morning in New Zealand, and Ewen had been introduced to my podcast, as he said, by Jenny, and he wanted to know if I would come out to New Zealand. At first I said no, and through his persistence and in later conversations, I changed my mind. Myself and Emma had a very, very positive meeting, as she said, in Ireland. We did it a bit differently. It worked really, really well. And based on what Ewen was saying was needed here and what he was hoping to achieve, I thought that it could work well as a combination between us. The day in Ewen's, we did it a little bit differently, and it just kind of worked out. We had something up our sleeves that we weren't sure if it would work or not until everyone arrived. And just the way people were standing around, people hadn't come in and taken their seats, so we played a little game with people and tried to push them outside their comfort zones. So you'll all be delighted that you came today and not the other day. But it was just what I was trying to do is create opportunities where people could be brought together and meet other people that are trying to do the same thing, because we tend to go to events and talk to the people that we came with or that we already know. And why I think this initiative is special, it's not really about what, like, it'd be naive of me to think myself and Emma are going to come in here in 2 weeks and change the world. One of the most significant things is that this is actually bringing the industry together. It's about you coming together in a room, the same as at Ewen's. I think that in itself is special. We, as Emma said, Ewen had lowered our expectations or increased our expectations in terms of the work that was required to bring the industry forward. Ewen and Penny put together an exceptional itinerary. We've met some really great people. We've seen some phenomenal countryside, great horses, and incredible hospitality. Really, I think there's so much positive has already happened. And for me, I would just like to see you package that and communicate that to the world. It's something we'll address later on in the talk, but I just think you have an incredible place. There's few places in the world will match New Zealand for breeding and raising horses. So I think it's important not just to acknowledge what we'll talk about at the end of this in terms of what needs to be done, but it's important to acknowledge what you've already done, what you have at your disposal, and the assets rather than the weaknesses as well. Because we've seen horses and we've seen breeders and we've met people that often there's this feeling here, I think, that people think because it's happening in Europe it's perfect. There's an awful lot of similarities in terms of the challenges between New Zealand, Ireland, Sweden. What we've said before is we all actually share similar challenges, and I think maybe Penny and Ewen were a bit surprised at that when we were having some of our Zoom calls in preparation for this. The problems might feel like they're New Zealand problems. They're actually international problems. Just it's magnified because of how far you are cut off from mainland Europe, where a lot of the action is happening. So it's to not be disheartened by that, because it's just, you might just have to work harder. But a lot of the solutions are already in place around the world. And I think you can just maybe take what has been done. You still have to be New Zealand. It's not that you don't have to be Ireland, you don't have to be Holland, you don't have to be Belgium. I think value what you have, it's special, and take what's already been done and adapt it to suit yourselves and your own sector. So for me, I'm going to talk, it's titled Perspectives from a Sport Horse Breeder, because all I can give you is my perspective. It's one opinion of many. And I suppose why I said no to you, and I don't know if I discussed this the last day, is because when he called and he listened to the podcast and he wanted me to come out, I just felt I haven't been alive long enough to come out and tell New Zealand what they need to be doing. I haven't been breeding long enough, and I'll touch on that in this. But that's why I said no first, because I wanted to make sure if you did something like this that you felt it was a worthwhile endeavour. When I had the backup of someone with Emma's experience, I felt as a combination, based on what we did in Ireland, we could hopefully achieve something positive. And what we said the last day is I think we were brought out to try and motivate or inspire the sector, and we were the ones that got motivated and inspired. So it's a significant credit to those that have hosted us, because we've had an incredible time. So what I'm going to cover today is just a little bit about my own background, not just for my own ego, because I think you might be able to draw something from it. Quarryfield Farm is our farm at home in Ireland. Big Talk for Breeders, which is my podcast, and it's how I suppose it's directly or indirectly the reason we're all here today. And then myself and Emma are just going to touch on some New Zealand observations as well, based on what we've seen, but also what we've heard from all the different meetings. A little bit of background. So I was born onto a dairy farm. As you can see from the top picture, I was in exceptional health from a young age. I wasn't born into a horse family. And this is, I suppose, why I'm thinking it's helpful. There's sometimes a perception. We put these barriers in place in our own minds that we have to be born into an equine dynasty, or we have to have been, a top-level rider. We have to be born into a wealthy family. All these things, and we put these barriers in our places in why we can't succeed as breeders. I'm not born into a wealthy family. I've said before, I think I said it on your podcast, I'm not from financial privilege. I might be from agricultural privileges because I was born into a farm. I'm very lucky that I don't have to go out and buy a farm. But not from a horse background, not from a wealthy background. Still can't ride. And I'm still trying to make my mark on the breeding world. So it's more from that perspective that sometimes we have these limiting beliefs that we tell ourselves why we can't achieve in the space that we want to achieve in, but it's just to maybe give a little bit of hope, or to get you to park those and focus on what you are good at. In terms of education, I studied equine business at a university called Maynooth in Kildare. And I guess it was thanks to that, and thanks to a summer placement that I did with the national governing body in Ireland called Horse Sport Ireland. I did a summer placement there. And I had only actually just taken an interest in breeding, and it was actually a loose enough interest before I studied equine business. It was typically a Bachelor of Business Studies, but we also learned about the horse industry in it. So from doing that and from doing the placement, it put me in a situation where I had all this access to information. That's obviously it's often the thing that we're struggling with the most as breeders, is access to information. So I was put in a situation where this new company had been brought together only a few months before I started working for them, where it was the breeding and the sport were brought together in one organisation. It was an incredible opportunity. I think it would have been harder for me to be more green and clueless than I was going into it, but I was really, really hungry for information, and I took every opportunity to get that. I did 3 summer placements. I ended up being offered a job in Horseport Ireland, and I worked there from 2010 until the end of 2018. I quit. Similarly to Emma, I had a desire to work for myself, doing a lot of the same things, but just being my own boss and making my own way. I suppose, one of the significant things that happened in my former working life is there was a program developed in Ireland by the Department of Agriculture called the Knowledge Transfer Program, and it was based around discussion groups in agricultural sectors. Those groups had happened before in maybe beef, sheep, dairy, but they'd never actually happened in horses. But in Ireland, I'm not fully sure where horses sit in New Zealand in terms of government departments, but in Ireland it actually falls under the remit of the Department of Agriculture. Now sometimes you need to remind the Department of Agriculture that that's the case, but in the last year or two we've got very good at doing that, which I can touch on later. The Knowledge Transfer Program was created. The idea was you bring groups of people together, like-minded individuals, and the groups were limited to 18 people. A facilitator could take on up to 5 groups, and out of some pure madness, I took on 5 groups in addition to the day job that I had, and that's why there's a significant change in the greys between some of those pictures and some of the ones that I have now. But it was a great opportunity. There were a lot of these breeders, and we've experienced it on this trip as well. There's a huge hunger to progress, but people don't know where to go to get the information that they require to progress. By bringing people together in breeders groups in a kind of a semi-structured manner 5 times a year created that opportunity that people were really, really looking for. When you bring people together, all sorts of things happen, but typically there are people that are comfortable speaking or asking questions. The idea was, like, I was a facilitator. I wasn't an educator. My role was to facilitate discussion. But I was always trying to think of new ways to encourage discussion, and that's why one of the reasons why we played the game the last day. And I would consume all variations of podcasts, TED Talks, whatever else, and I hit on a TED Talk one day that was about the idea of big talk as opposed to small talk, and it's how we can make meaningful connections with people instead of just the hi, how are you, and we're not waiting for the answer and we don't know what to do when we get the answer. So there was a card game developed off the back of Big Talk, which I thought was a great idea, but I thought was maybe a bit too personal to play with these groups. I was dealing with them professionally, and I rewrote 30 questions that were more orientated towards someone breeding horses, and I played it with the group, and people who would never speak in any of the meetings then nearly couldn't stop themselves because it had triggered them talking about the thing that they love and are so passionate about, and that's what everybody shares here. So it's creating those opportunities for people to talk about that. We thought there was some bit of magic. I had trialed it with one group. It worked really well. People who thought that they knew each other really well found out new things about each other from just one simple question. So I played it with the 5 groups and it worked really well, and we thought there was more in it. Through that, we decided, a few of us were talking about the potential of it, and I asked Luc Henry, a successful breeder in Belgium, if he would be willing to sit down, and I'd give him 10 of these questions and we'd record the answer, make it available, and if hopefully at least one person got something from it. I think it ended up surpassing any of our expectations. I took just generic questions, and I have some of them here if anyone wants to look at them. We didn't, as I said, we didn't play them, but you're welcome to have a look through. And what I was amazed at is they were just generic questions, and here was someone really successful, influential, not just in breeding, but in my life. He's probably one of the breeders that had the biggest impact on me. And the answers, the honesty with which he answered them, and the fact that they made him so emotional, I thought there was something incredibly powerful here again, and I just kept going and developed the podcast, which we'll talk about later. In terms of current roles, even though that knowledge transfer program is finished, I still felt it was important to continue working with those groups, which I do. I constantly feed them information. I have WhatsApp groups for each of the 5 groups, a Facebook group for all of them to come together, and then at least once a year I try and bring them together. I have a speaker like Emma come in, and sometimes we do a combination of the big talk where they register and I mix them up with people that they mightn't have yet met or that I think could benefit from each other, and then we bring in the speaker as well to kind of further educate or inspire. I'm breeding at home, so we have a farm at the moment now. I started breeding in 2013, and we have horses and sheep at home, and we have a few smaller kind of agri-tourism businesses on the farm. I work part-time for a company called Hippomundo, which I'll touch on later, and then there's a few other different roles helping people buy and sell bits and pieces, source mares, things like that. There's a good chance that I might forget it, so I'll mention it now because I forgot it at Ewen's. Before I came over, I just made a little 2-page flyer. I won't spend too much time talking about my own mares or my own breeding program, but I just made a flyer there with, it just has the details of our farm. On the back of it has the foals that we're expecting next year. So if you are interested in seeing what mares we have, what foals we have, feel free to take a copy of that because I forgot to actually hand them out at Ewen's the last day. Just a brief overview of our farm. I thought I had a decent sized farm until I came to New Zealand. I think you'd probably refer to it as a lifestyle block now. It's a 95 acre farm in the west of Ireland, which seems to be like maybe most of your gardens from what we've seen so far. The scale at which you operate, it just kind of blows our mind. So things aren't always bigger and better in Europe. If I was to stop here and just leave that there and leave everyone stare at that for the next hour, I think I probably would have done enough. So when I started working with Horse Sport Ireland, I felt I wanted to kind of get some skin in the game, and I thought if I was going to be working in the industry, it was actually an essential requirement for me to have skin in the game, because I think you can be far more impactful when you're living and suffering the same realities as the people that you're trying to bring together. And in 2013, I got the opportunity to buy kind of a well-bred, well-related mare, and I don't know if there's a short version of that. I don't know if I have the ability to do short versions, so I hope nobody's in a rush home. But I got the opportunity to buy a mare, and the gist of it was, as I said, I'm not from a particularly wealthy background, but I was just so determined that I needed to buy this mare. So we have a thing called a credit union in Ireland, which is like a small, maybe more community-based bank. And I went and I took out a car loan. And actually at the time, not only did I not have the money to buy the mare, but I actually didn't even have the money. You're supposed to have a certain amount of money to be able to get a certain amount of a loan. I didn't even have that. But I was just so determined this is what I had to do. And for some bizarre reason, nobody tried to talk me out of it. The only thing my parents said is, if this goes wrong, we can't help you. But they never said, don't do it, which was great. It also lit the fire under my ass because I now had a foal coming that was far superior to anything I had ever, we had around the farm before. Typically it was just ponies and my sister's riding horse and things like that. But it forced me to kind of get very clever and try and create my own market. I thought coming into the industry without any background was going to be a big disadvantage, but it's actually incredibly freeing because you decide your way. And what you do is you set out and you decide what it is that I want to breed, and then you look at who's succeeded in that space and what have they done. So what I forgot to mention actually the last day, for those of you who were at Ewen's, I struggle, well it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I don't often lie. And taking out the bank loan or taking out the car loan to buy the mare actually made me feel quite guilty. But I decided that I'd call the first foal White Lies. I forgot to mention that part the last day. Now, unfortunately for me, I thought I was going to go on and win the Olympics and be a great story, but it's ended up as an amateur horse. So that's the realities of the whole thing. But I suppose on my pursuit to try and figure out how to go about being a successful not just sport horse breeder, but breeder of show jumpers, at some stage along the way I decided I was really, really focused on breeding show jumpers for the very top of the sport, whatever that might be, because we don't know, the Olympics could be pulled tomorrow, there might be any Olympics, but just whatever the top version of the sport is at any given time, that's what I wanted to be breeding. So that's when I set out, and any time I had any spare money or time or space on a credit card, I got on a plane and I tried to travel and seek out the people who were doing it well. So you'll see kind of how this, and then later doing the knowledge transfer program, the big talk questions kind of all came together, because every time I'd come back from one of these trips, sometimes I did it with other breeders and sometimes I did it by myself. You have to get a bit comfortable about potentially being a weirdo and cold calling people or turning up at their farm and interrogating them for hours on end. But I thought everyone was very interested in hearing like what kind of the insights were, or like what did I learn. But I know it's not always possible for people, especially I suppose in New Zealand, it's even harder to make those trips and go visit those breeders in Europe. So it's the combination of what I was seeking and then the big talk game through the groups that kind of came together, and I thought I've developed this good network and I've met all these incredible breeders, and that we can kind of package some of that and give it away to other people to help them. But if there was one thing that it all came back to, and we will touch on it in terms of the learnings when I go on to Big Talk, was this is what it was all about. And actually, sorry, I should have mentioned, one thing that I thought was a bit strange was I would go to all these successful breeders, and it was mares, and exceptional mares. It was all about the mare. And you gather all the information that you can around the industry to try and learn as much as you can, and all the publications are stallions. And I thought, like, this thing is all fairly backwards or upside down. And obviously, the thing is, the people who, a lot of the time, the only people who are making money out of breeding is the people who are selling to breeders, not the people who are breeding the horses. And a lot of the time, obviously, a lot of the literature that's around is around people who own stallions and are trying to promote the stallions. So when I quit my job, I had all these kind of ideas floating around and insights and focus on mares and significant mares and all this. And the other aspect that I saw was that we are producing this, in essence, a luxury good, something that the world could probably live without, if worst came to worst. And yet, even though we're producing this high-end luxury good, we then market it like it's just a commodity, it's a litre of milk. If you look at a lot of the adverts, you have Trade Me, we have Done Deal, and you look through the adverts and the quality of how people then present this luxury good to the world, it's often, fairly inferior. And it's just something maybe you'd reflect on, because I'm sure in the coming months or years, you're going to be advertising something, and to maybe just, if you just shift it in your mind, and if you think of it, I often say think of it like art, that if you're creating, because we are creating art, like we're, in some weird way, we all are artists in terms of our creations. And if you think of it like you're creating, marketing, selling art, I think you'll just shift the focus on how you advertise that then when the time comes, because it's all a completely emotional purchase. Like, how much logic is there in what people pay for horses in this industry. So people are buying on emotion, and they're buying on a dream. They're buying their future medalist, or their hope at a future medal. So you still have to deal with people in reality and be honest, but you are packaging a dream. And it's to just think about that. So what I decided to do was, after I quit my job, I decided to get all these kind of ideas down on paper. We all travel around. I could talk to a bunch of you today, and we could go back and forth on what mares we have and what foals we have. And by the time you've got in the car, we've probably all forgotten, because we'll have talked to another few people beforehand. And I was traveling around to all these places, and I thought, like, I really wanted something that when I meet these people, prospective buyers or existing buyers, or someone nice that you meet, a fellow breeder, that you could actually just give them something that packaged your horses or your mares or your farm in the way that you felt was important. So I created this where I profiled each of the mares and their families, and like 5-generation pedigrees and things like that, and tried to produce it like you would if you went in and found a catalogue for any high-end luxury good, to really put down on paper kind of what I believe and how significant these mares are. And yes, it took a lot of time, and yes, it was expensive, but I'm glad I did it. But the opening page starts. It's all about the mare, and as you'll see, if you know, as you go through it, you'll realise that I suppose I stay fairly true to that as much as I can. I'm not going to dwell on this. This year we only typically breed 5 or less foals a year. I want to keep it small and keep the quality high. I've no desires to be a mass producer. So we had 5 born this year, and the list on the back will show you what's coming. There's 7 coming this year, but that's just kind of the way it worked out. One mare flushed 2 embryos. We had planned on taking 1, she flushed 2, and I got a chance to take on a mare to take an embryo from that. It was an offer I couldn't refuse. I've added this in because I think it's back to that all information and knowing where to go, and we've had lots of interesting conversations and showing people, I suppose, the sources that certainly us at home, what we access. When we were in Beaumont, Emma went through different sources of linear profiling information, and a lot of this information is either available for free or actually for a low price. I'm always amazed if people won't pay for some of these services because they cost 70 or 100 euro for the year. But then we have no problem paying several thousand for a stud fee, or buying a straw that, you know, it's Russian roulette that we have no guarantees on. Or then, you know, if you think about the value of the animal that you're trying to create and you're trying to breed, an investment in some of these is fairly cheap in that whole process. So I've just put down the pedigree and performance databases, which we can talk about. Clip My Horse on YouTube, I think, is essential. If you are only consuming the videos from the stud farms that they want you to see, what aspects of the horse are you going to see? Their job is to sell you stud fees. It's not to tell you about the negatives of the horse, the time it got eliminated, the time it buried the rider. Clip My Horse YouTube, you'll probably just see the good ones that they put out, unless there's someone particularly malicious that has been recording from the warm-up arena. But the likes of Clip My Horse is a really, really, really important tool. Unfortunately, I think they have the option where you can actually pay to have a video removed. I don't necessarily agree with that, but exactly. And it's back to that idea of watching the warm-up. Sometimes you go to a show, if it is recorded on Clip My Horse, spend more of your time at the warm-up, because you can't watch that back on Clip My Horse. You can watch the competition back on Clip My Horse, and you get a hell of an education. So the other thing is with that, don't just look at the stallion at the height of its career, because if it's with one of the best riders in the world, are you seeing the true picture? What can they, with their skill set, can they camouflage? Sometimes what I would do is, if I'm interested in a stallion and he is older, I would try and go back and find the videos of him as young as possible, with maybe a lesser rider or a young horse producer. Because when you breed your mare to that, you have a higher chance of getting that video of him as a 4-year-old than you will of, Marcus Enning jumping around Aachen on him as a 12-year-old. That's not always the real version of what that horse was born to do. Attending shows and events is essential, same books and magazines and informed friends and contacts. I'll try not to do too much of a sales pitch on this. I am obviously incredibly biased. I work for Hippomundo part-time, so I don't know if I can give any disclosures. Actually, the other disclosure is, Emma asked a good question. Do I get paid if someone uses this discount? The answer is no. I asked for this discount because I sometimes feel it's back to that thing, breeders are hesitant to spend that, whatever, €70 or €100, and it's like, if I just wanted them to give me something that when I'm talking to breeders, if for anyone that can't see it, the discount code is BIG20, and it's available for first-time registrations. So the guys at Hippomundo had given me this that I could give to people in my groups or people that I'm working with. Just to put it into context, in terms of information, there's currently about 1.5 million horses in the database. I think last year alone we inputted 600,000 individual sporting results. All the FEI results go in, and about 200 to 300,000 national results from around the world every year. The beauty of it is it's factual information. Everything's verified. It's not somebody putting out a version of something that they want you to eat up. So be it Hippomundo or any other database, if it's verified and, do you call it objective? Is that the term? Like where it's not kind of not open to interpretation as such. There's a whole range of different rankings, tools, contact pages. Because you are cut off from the world, think of all the ways that you can make yourself, that sounds extreme, cut off from the world, but you know what I mean in terms of cut off from a lot of mainland Europe. It's to make yourself accessible or visible wherever possible. So there's things you can do on this where you can, once you have a membership, you can add a breeder's page or an owner's page or different contact pages that make yourself available at the click of a button. Because you want, when you have the good horses or the interesting young horse from a good dam line, you want to make it as easy as possible for people to go straight to you, not to someone else that's going to play with your deal or anything like that, straight to you, so as much as possible. Can I mention the other bit? So one of the things is one of the common themes and I suppose challenges or concerns that we've seen from our time in New Zealand is that it's not a given that every horse is registered and has a microchip and has DNA, has its parents' DNA verified. And one of the conversations with Ewen, and I mentioned it the last day, was when he was telling us about the industry, and he said something in conversation about like horses not having a passport or horses not having like maybe 2 or 3 generations not being recorded. I said to Ewen, and in a fairly blunt, I think, response, it was out before I probably thought about it, that if that's the case, we're wasting our time even coming here. And why I'm telling you that again is that until it is a given that every horse, every foal in this country has a microchip, and if you know the breeding, if it's not recorded with DNA like verified or verification, then everything else, all the wish list of the industry will be close to impossible. That's your building block, or that's your foundation, and everything else is built upon that. In terms of rankings, credibility, and I said it the last day, but I can say with a high degree of certainty, until that is a given, you will not be able to establish international credibility of selling your horses. Because if you don't know the horse that you're being sold is that horse, that has a microchip, that the pedigree you're being sold is that pedigree, it's going to be exceptionally challenging. And thankfully, some of the people that we visited on this trip, we might have had a conversation, a very firm conversation one night, and by the time we get to breakfast in the morning, it's number one on the list for when we go is that they're getting their horses sorted, and that in itself has made it worthwhile, because it is so essential. And I was really, of all the things I had heard coming, that was one of the things that took me back the most, that wasn't a given. So the other thing was, once that information is recorded, it's to be able to utilize that information so that then you can benefit from that, learn from that, promote that to the world, and hopefully very shortly the New Zealand Warm Blood Association is going to be entering into an official cooperation with Hippomundo, meaning that all the pedigree records from that stud book will automatically go in here. So all your horses and pedigrees and you as breeders will be represented in Hippomundo internationally, and I am absolutely delighted with that, and I can't wait for that to happen. Now, eventually I got there, Ewan. That was a big sigh. Big talk for breeders. Some of you will have already listened to it before, heard of it. I've heard of it before. At the moment, there's 20 different episodes. I would like there to be more, but sometimes my challenge is, obviously, it takes time. I create it for free. I give it away for free. A lot of the time, I need to spend my time, working on things that are going to keep the lights on. But it has been an incredible experience going around interviewing these breeders. I typically do it in their own homes. I try and do it where they're most comfortable. 2 or 3 of them have been done on Zoom for different reasons, either geographical constraints or, say, during COVID, and that when it wasn't possible. But it's an incredibly special thing, and the beauty of it is, if I had a camera on these breeders, a lot of the time people get uncomfortable, or if I was just writing interviews, it's kind of open to interpretation, the tone that they meant it in. Whereas I think it's really special that you actually can't see them, and you just have to listen. And it's not just what they said, but sometimes how they said it. And through the process, I did the first one with Luke Henry in 2018. And while I mentioned this the last day as well, but Guy Hodgson, there's a YouTube version of a talk that we did at the Dublin Horse Show, and it's I'd like you to watch it for a few different reasons. One is to see maybe something similar that you could copy to run at your own events. A lot of the time we have really, how would you say it? We have really knowledgeable people at events, and we have lots of breeders at these events that are hungry for the knowledge, but it's to create those opportunities where they can learn from them. So at the Dublin Horse Show, I put together a panel of 3 speakers, and I interviewed people, and breeders could register for free. We had a max capacity, but they could come for free. But Guy Hodgson, who was one of the speakers at it, he's originally from South Africa, and he lives in Texas. He just made the example that you go around and you talk to all these experienced breeders, and they're all so convinced that their way is the only way, but yet they all have a different way. So how is one way the only way? And the thing is, you have to find your own way in this, but there's things from each one that you can learn. And as we'll go on to, there's reoccurring themes that kept coming up, and that's the basis of what Ewen wanted to touch on today. Okay. Speed up. Oh, it's hard to hear, is it? Okay, we'll start to make our way back. Just everyone's had the chance to stretch their legs. It probably wasn't quick enough if anyone was sneaking out for a smoke, but... Okay, we've lost a good few. Do you think they're coming back? Okay. Hopefully they can hear me outside anyway. So, I had tried to boil it down to kind of 4 reoccurring themes amongst all the breeders. One is about how welcoming and opening a lot of these breeders have been, and it's sometimes the surprising thing because they're obviously they've been very successful. They're very busy. Sometimes the people that I've interviewed are very strong characters that sometimes you would think mightn't be the most approachable. Yeah, but I've been amazed at how open they are. And why I want to start with this is if there are people whose breeding programs, sports stables, whatever it be, you admire, just push yourself that little bit to reach out to them and ask, can you meet them? Can you call them? Can you go and visit their place? Because it is amazing. There's a lot of things that, if they come and speak at an event, there's probably a lot of things that they can't say as much as they can say. But it's a great opportunity to kind of really get the full story and get an insight into what these people are doing and what led them to be successful. And the other thing is, I'm delighted with the spread of ages today, and what I've been very, very surprised at is I was really surprised that how opening they were over the last 10 or 15 years to a young breeder coming, that you can think, sure, what do I have to offer them? Sometimes what you have to offer them is an opportunity for them to talk about their breeding program, and a lot of the time you think, oh, they're going to have people plaguing them the whole time. In the horse world, a lot of people don't really give breeders that much time of the day, regardless of how successful they are. I think as an industry internationally, we're really, really, really bad at acknowledging and rewarding breeders. It's not just a New Zealand problem. It's an international problem. It's getting better. There's different initiatives. So when you're giving these people an opportunity, you're coming and more or less saying, like, I admire what you've done or what you spent your life creating, and I'd like to learn about it. And there's very few of them that aren't delighted to do that. And especially, I think, sometimes when you go one-to-one, you often get maybe a more complete version of their success story. But definitely, like, I know different people we've met have been good about going to top shows together, or like there seems to be a bunch of Kiwis that were at Las Vegas, at the World Cup final and things like that. So maybe pair up. If it is a bit more daunting, pair up with 2 or 3 people and go and approach some of these people, especially in Holland and Belgium. I think once there's someone from outside their own country coming, they're very business orientated, so they're delighted to have you in because they probably think there's a chance that you'll do business at some point. So, and they're not really subtle about that either. So it's actually good that but it's helpful because there's, they're hoping they'll sell you a horse, so they'll show you around for a while. So utilize that. Something that's very clear, and something that I tried to get very clear on myself, was the goal of it all. We've asked every breeder that we've visited on this trip, we've actually done a questionnaire with them, and we've tried to get some clarity around what they're doing, because we are so busy in the day-to-day maintenance and survival that sometimes you don't stop to think, like, what is it that I'm doing this for? What's the ultimate thing that I'm trying to achieve? And in a lot of the cases of these successful breeders, they're crystal clear on what it is they're trying to create, the thing they're trying to win, the type of horse they're trying to produce. And I find once you get that settled in your head, things become clear. It's like the fog goes away, because something I had on a previous slide was to block out the noise. There's so much going on in the industry, and if you're worried about what you think everyone else thinks you should be breeding, you're just like, you're kind of dizzy, whereas it's about what you want to breed, what you want to achieve, and they're very, very clear on that, and they do everything in their power to go in that one direction. And often it comes at the expense of other aspects of their life, but I suppose it's like any athlete as well. There's a price to pay for greatness. High standards as well. I think I've been amazed at some of the places in terms of the level that they push this to. Emma has an example that she might talk on with her former podcast host or co-host and what he does in his breeding program. I'll let Emma talk about that in a second. But the standards that they hold themselves to, and I was kind of amused when we were talking, Paul, you mentioned it earlier about some mares that you've now used as recipient mares, even though actually they, like on paper, they might have had the credentials. And I'll just mention one example of a breeder in Belgium where I brought 2 Irish breeders to visit his place. I know he's very extreme, but I think that's why he's been able to deliver results kind of so quickly and so consistently. So I had these breeders there. We were going around showing the mares, and he goes, "Oh, that's an Irish mare." So the 2 Irish guys that were with me were delighted, and he mentioned the name of the mare, and she was a mare that had competed on our national Grand Prix circuit. She had one offspring that was doing reasonably well in the young horse classes, and the guys were really excited. And what's she in foal to? And he laughed and he said, "She's a recipient mare." So she had jumped 140, she had bred a decent young horse, and the guys, I think, just couldn't get over that, because that was a mare that they probably would have been delighted to breed from. And as he explained it, he's trying to breed and produce horses that he sells, like to be the best sport horses in the world, the best show jumpers in the world. And he said, if she breeds me 2 Grand Prix horses out of 10, which most of us would be absolutely delighted with, he said, that means I lose money on 8. And I just thought it was such an interesting way to look at it. And obviously it's extreme, but sometimes you have to be extreme. But it just really kind of made it clear in my mind, just the level that these men and women are pushing themselves to achieve greatness on a consistent level. And it doesn't mean, like, as we were saying the last day when we were talking about the age of mares and after the first 4 foals and things like that, it doesn't mean that you have to go out and put everything in the trailer and off with them when you get home today. But it's maybe to just reflect on your own standards that you hold yourself to, the quality of your mare, your own selection process, what you will and won't accept and why. And when I stop believing it's something at home, I've tried to park the emotion where possible, and the second I stop believing in something at home, sell it as quick as you can, is how I've approached it anyway. And you can take from this what you want, because once that doubt creeps in, you won't cover them to the best stallion that you can find in the world. You probably won't put in the same work or enthusiasm in their offspring. And that's what I've seen with them. Sometimes it seems crazy. There's mares you dream of breeding and they're carrying embryos for them. But that's why they're successful. But then the one thing it all came down to was their success was built on the exceptional mares that they had, that they bought or that they bred or found or whatever. It wasn't down to the success across the board has not been down to, oh, they're really lucky because they used Stallion A. It was, they had really, really exceptional mares and they bred from those exceptional mares and they focused on those, either an exceptional mare or core group of mares, and then their daughters, the best daughters of the best mares, over and over and over again. And we had a discussion the last day on types of mares and things like that, and it's something we could talk about all day. But what I was really surprised at is I expected to see this perfect picture when I was going and seeing the mothers of all these good horses, that there was this perfect picture of what the perfect mare was going to be, and she was going to be, as we said, for those, some of you have heard this already, but it's this perfect 16-2 bay mare, maybe with a nice stripe or a star. There was all going to be this perfect model that was going to breed these superstars. But that's not what I found. A lot of the qualities were sometimes actually they were internal qualities, and sometimes I think in the majority of cases, their success has been breeding out of naturally careful, natural talents. In a lot of cases with these mares, they weren't always the biggest, they weren't always the scopiest mares, but they were really careful, maybe blood types, blood in their head, sometimes quite difficult to manage. Sometimes these hardy little mares that as young ones you might actually walk past. And that's something that I've tried to remember even when I'm trying to select at home. If something is really naturally careful, like quick, careful, like electric, and maybe doesn't have all the scope in the world, that's one of the easier things to add in, to pick your stallions with the size and scope. Because actually, in terms of, as your broodmare, they don't need to necessarily have Olympic scope, to justify staying in your breeding program if they have loads of the other qualities that you're looking for, but most importantly that they're naturally careful. So that was kind of the gist of the common themes. And actually, I nearly forgot. Would you just mention about Gustav's approach? And this is one of the more extreme ones.
Yeah, and he's a dressage breeder. And he started out coming from family who were not dealing with horses, but he spent a lot of his time with an older breeder and learning a lot from her. And when he started breeding as a very young guy, he got some mares from her, which would then have been really good mares in terms of performance and offspring. And he started breeding, and then with one of his first crops, he put a few stallions forward for the stallion selections, and he's also an accomplished Grand Prix rider, so he would train them himself, ride them themselves, and none of them became approved. And at that point, he told me, he asked himself, what am I doing? Because I want to breed the best. I want to go to the Olympics with my horse, and this is not good enough. So what he started to do was that if a mare breeds good offspring in his eyes, he keeps her. But if she breeds one offspring that he's not satisfied with, then she's out. And then he puts in something new, young, and what he finds superior. And this is what he's been doing for about 10 years now, more perhaps. He's between 35 and 40. And today he's one of the most successful dressage breeders in Sweden, although his oldest products would be about 10 years now, and they would then be from the first mares. But in terms of young horse competitions, he's produced horses going to the World Championships for young horses, placed in the finals there. They are placed with the best dressage riders in Sweden. So he's gone that road, and so far seems very successful when it comes to that. Now, that would be a very extreme variant, and of course there are mares that could breed one or two bad offspring, but it's a good example on how you can work with tough selection, I think.
And one of the things I think we've been surprised at here is it seems to be those who are using loose jumping as an assessment within their own breeding program, they seem to be in the minority here, whereas it seems to be a lot more commonplace in mainland Europe. And it's not to be like setting up the horses or playing tricks with the horses, but it's to give yourself a quicker feedback loop on which either fillies to continue with if you want to retain a filly, but also it's giving you quicker information on what your mare is producing. Because a lot of the time, people that we've met, there's not really a full market here as such, as my understanding, whereas at home a lot of breeders are maybe selling as foals, but where a lot of the time they're being kept until there's a few seasons in them under saddle or they're up and running. And maybe, say for instance, if you're not doing a lot of jumping if you're not loose jumping them at 2 or 3, and then you're not really doing a whole lot of competition at 4, maybe before they're really up and running they're 5. So, and then maybe they start to disappoint you when they are asked the questions. And it's not that they can't improve, but maybe if they're not good enough, you probably have a 4-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 2-year-old, a yearling and a foal at home, and the mare's probably in foal. Because if you haven't also loose jumped the 4-year-old, I wouldn't be looking forward to the 5-year-old year. And then you have the 3-year-old, and I just think you can react when there's an expression like you can't improve what you don't measure type thing, that if it's where do I want to go, the standards that you need to put in place, and the different points at which you're going to ask the questions and decide if something goes or stays. And sometimes we have this guilt about moving on the mare. But as I often say to people at home, does the mare really care who feeds her in the morning? Like if it's you or if it's the person that bought her, and she might be perfect for someone else's breeding program because they're maybe a few steps further down behind, say, in their breeding program, and she might be perfect for them for a few years. So she could have a perfect life somewhere else. But I think sometimes we're afraid to move them on out of that guilt, but yet we're willing to cause ourselves harm by not moving them on, detrimental on our breeding program and on our finances. And if you persevere with the mare for another 10 years that you knew wasn't good enough 10 years ago, you're not going to get a pat on the back or a medal or anything like that. So, and it's very disheartening as well, and there's a good chance that that's probably, if you do that with a few mares, that'll deter you from breeding fairly quickly. So it's just to reflect on that. I'm just going to ask, was there anything that we covered the last day, Ewen, that we haven't touched on today that we need to touch on? Okay. I'd say poor Emma now she's had to travel around with me since, 10 days? 10 days, so it's probably a bit intense. Just lastly, yes, I'll give you this just so they can, well, it's more for the recording actually, if you don't mind, yeah.
Okay. How much of emphasis do you put on the correct training of a horse? Because I believe that's very important. In breeding, you have correct training.
Yeah, and it's something actually we've worked into the next slide that myself and Emma are going to talk about, is young horse training, young horse producers, young horse championships, young horse pathways, because you can breed all these exceptional talents, but if the next stage of the process they're going to be wrecked, we're kind of all wasting our time. So there's a few basic things that maybe as an industry you could look at either doing or improving that I think would increase the chances of these horses coming through the system. So we might go on to that if that's all right. So what we did was, every person that we visited, we did this survey with them, this questionnaire, predominantly focusing on their own breeding program, but asked each of them what are the things, the initiatives that they would like to see in New Zealand that they think would help the sector, predominantly with a breeding lens. And we combine that with what we were seeing or hearing, or things that, be it from Sweden or Ireland, or we have a lot of contacts and visits to Holland, Belgium, Germany, France. So it's not that we have all the answers, but we've seen a lot of what's worked in other countries. So that was the start of it all. A lot has happened since you picked us up at the airport in Auckland. And this is the inside of our minds after 10 days in New Zealand. I know it's going to be hard to see some of the things, but what we might do is just touch on some of the points, and we have a copy for you as well, Julian. So one of the things that we wanted to do was not just come here, have a look around, and go home, but it was to have the opportunities for meetings with yourselves, but also debriefs. So with Equestrian Sport New Zealand, with the likes of Ewen and Penny, who have put this trip together, and to kind of go through the key aspects, and an awful lot of them are interlinked. and some of them are repeated. And maybe we've put this down in a simpler form. Sometimes they're relevant to maybe multiple entities or organisations. There's also needs to be more cooperation amongst the entities that already exist, all moving towards for the greater good. Where do you want to start?
Doesn't mean that you all have to want or do the same things. Look at Sweden. As I told you, it was not the straight road, but you all have to work towards the same goal, and you all have to be aware that perhaps more that you can identify that needs attention. And start with attention and you work your way from there. But that this is what's been the common themes mentioned when we have traveled around, and both mentioned by the breeders and what we've figured out ourselves. So it may seem like a long list and might seem intimidated, but I'm sure also we wouldn't know, as Michael said before, we wouldn't know about all the initiatives that are already taken or something's going on already. But just start somewhere and work your way through it.
Also, I suppose the first thing is, if you were to go home and do one action, and it's not necessarily just a request, and it's not for me. My life doesn't necessarily change if this happens or doesn't. This is for yourselves, it's more an essential step that each of you need to take individually to move forward collectively. It's to set a realistic timeline by which time every horse on your place has a microchip, a studbook, passport, and if you know the sire and the dam, that it's DNA tested to that. Because until we solve that part, if that part isn't solved, because there's things that the industry needs to do for you, but that's why I have a lot of respect and admiration for what Ewen has done here. Typically people look at and talk about what the industry should be doing for them. A small few people go out and try and do something for the industry. So it's to think about what you can all contribute yourselves. But the first thing, even before you go helping at your local equestrian centre or volunteering at a show or anything like that, the first thing that you can do for yourselves is call your vet, set a date. And I know it's expensive if there's a lot that you haven't done, like because in some cases we've seen a lot of horses and there's a lot of missing chips and passports, but just maybe even start at the older ones and work back, because say for instance...
No, start with the young ones.
Well, I'll just give an example on that. We were in one place where a lot of the horses went back to, I'd actually like if they were all done in the one day, but I have to be realistic. There was one situation where a lot of the horses went back to one particular mare on the place. The mare was 32 and she didn't have a passport. And it'd be just, they've then gone on multiple generations and they built their breeding program on that. And if she had keeled over in the morning and was taken away, and then when she's already gone, they think, I never took a hair sample. She's gone. That's gone forever. And I just don't want that to happen to people, because those anchors of people's breeding programs could be so easily lost.
That's true, and at least then pull the hairs. Even if you don't want to pay for the test today, pull the hairs, put them directly in a plastic bag and close it and seal it and mark it so that you have it there, because as you say, she might go and die the day after. And we were talking also before here about which ones to start with, and someone said, well, you don't have to do it with the sport horses or the geldings because they won't go into breeding. But if you intend to do some statistics on the inheritance of your stallions or your mares, those are the products that will help to the statistics. And if you're not sure who's their father or who's their mother when it's sold later on, that won't produce reliable figures for you. So they are actually just as important.
What I was delighted to hear is, and maybe Julian or Linda, maybe you'd like to come in on this, but that there is ongoing work within the industry with working groups. There's been work done in the past, and there seems to be work being done currently to put that data side of the picture in place. Would either of you like to say a few words on it? Oh, I can give you one each.
Thanks. ESNZ's had a database, I'm going to say issue or opportunity, perhaps it's an opportunity, for quite some time now. A new registration system's been launched that's supposed to have taken the bugs out from the past, and we've found a few new bugs, and it hasn't gone quite as smoothly, but it's certainly getting there. The other thing we tried to do, which is the results part of that, so there's two parts to that for me. There's the registration side, information around horses, breeding, all of that information that we should collect, along with the results piece. Now the results piece, what we've attempted to do is bring 25 years of data into one database, and that's coming from about 5 different databases that are all set up differently, and that's proved way more problematic than anybody suggested that it would be. So the one good thing about that, I guess, is through perseverance, we're getting close to having 25 years of data on horses in this country on a database that can feed into any other database, or, you know, if Jody's got something set up and we're looking for results, how do those two systems talk to each other? How do we share that information? So it's been frustrating, probably as much for the staff as it has for the members who, you know, we've been promising this thing, but we're nearly there, and when it is completed, it'll give us what we need. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Linda. I mean, 25 years of data, I'm horrified that we're bringing in 25 years, because every time you bring in historical data, you have issues, and it's not clean, and there's bugs in it. So
I think just picking up from that is around the work that is happening, and some, but not everyone, may be aware that within the New Zealand Equine Health Association there is work doing with regards to the development and working with government, with the MPI, around, and it's coming from a largely regulatory framework, and that's around the compliance for traceability, being able to trace for and largely driven from a biosecurity perspective. So that will happen. So when I had a catch up on that yesterday, that is a non-negotiable, and that will be happening. So what is the time frame around that? I can't answer that, but that would be helpful for us to have some understanding of what that time frame is, because there is no doubt in any breeding program, no matter what species we talk about, the integrity of your data is your starting point. And if we don't have the integrity of the data, we can't make that progress. We can't look at breeding values. We can't look at any indexes. We can't look at any SAR rankings. So, and then to be able to link up internationally to meet some of your breeding objectives, that needs to be in place.
I guess, yeah. Sorry, Linda, I thought you'd finished.
Yeah. No, so I think from the point of view of then is what is that's available to us. It's awesome we've got that performance data, but what is available to us, and it will be there because both Emma, who's working on the database currently, and Kate, who's is involved in both those with the NZ EHA and with ESNZ, is the knowledge of how that will then be captured and stored. So I think the conversation now becomes around what can we do to support breeders to allow that to progress whilst it's being driven from a biosecurity traceability perspective.
I mean, the solution's kind of in this room, right? If you're a breeder and want to be part of a breeding program, your message is fairly simple. Get your horses chipped so you can start to get a program. So I can't make anybody in the room get their horse chipped. I can suggest that that's a good idea if you want to be a breeder. And that comes back to your earlier question, is why are people here? You know, what's your why? Are you breeding horses for fun? You want to breed champions? Are you a high-performance breeding program? And, you know, it's costing between $70 and $200 to get a horse chipped, is my understanding from the research that we've done. So, you know, we can make suggestions, and as an organisation we can provide data and feedback, but that's the type of change of mindset. And you remember, probably only a small portion of our membership is interested in breeding. I'm not saying that's good or bad, I'm saying that's just what it is. So if there's 10% of a membership that want to be involved in breeding and have their horses chipped and collect data and information and develop the industry, then, you know, we're all for that. So yeah, like, it's about the collective making the decision, and then how we all come together to provide more opportunities. So, I mean, days like this are invaluable. So,
and probably just worth mentioning, I mean, the development of that database that will sit in an agreement which will be government funded, and it will be free to enter data. So then the key to that is the fact of the APIs that sit in place to drag in data and have that data exchange going from that. So it's not that that will all be held within the SNZ, because people will load it through the breed societies, or it might be through the pony club, and then it's then how that data is through APIs is then in that shared geospatial platform is what I'm understood it is called. So yeah, exciting opportunity. I mean, it will happen, but it's what can we do in the interim to ensure that our breeders are able to really get underway with their journey around honouring their breeding objectives.
Thank you very much. And sometimes as well, what we've seen at home is just a slight tangent, but it's back to what you can do individually and collectively. A lot of the time, it's very easy to sit home and think, whatever organisation, whatever studbook, ESNZ should be doing and isn't doing. But sometimes what can be really, really helpful is put down your thoughts, your plans, your ideas in an email and send it into the specific office, because every entity has like manpower issues or financial resource issues, and sometimes the best ideas come from outside an organisation. So it's just, if you have something that you've been kicking around your head or you're working on, I don't think any organisation would not like to hear that. And we've heard lots of different great ideas, and there's lots of different people we've met on this trip that I think as an organisation or as an industry perhaps could be either better utilised or supported. There's an incredible amount of knowledge in the country, and even in the likes of facilities. We had the good fortune of spending a night at Takapoto, and like that facility is as good as anything. Like, it's this again, this idea that Europe, everything in Europe's better, that's as good as anything in Europe. Like, it's as good as any of the facilities. I don't believe that we have one facility like that in Ireland, and you have it here. So it's, I suppose, and that's come from, you know, private investment, and I think Mitch and family have done an incredible thing there, and it'd be great to see it supported, or if anyone is developing something similar that I'm not aware of, to see it supported. So it's to see within your own areas even who you can get behind and who you can help and support, because it's not possible for one person, one family, or one organisation to do everything. Once we have the data thing, and you know, by the end of next week, once all your horses are microchipped and DNA, I don't know what the turnaround is, Jodie, but I'm sure Jodie will do the best that she can. Then it can feed into kind of a whole raft of things. And actually, going back to your question on the young horse production, that was a thing over and over and over and over again. Everyone we talked to was the frustration around the challenges producing young horses here, in terms of training young riders or training young horse producers. Was a challenge in terms of the maybe available championships for them to compete in. A lot of the surfaces, the feeling is that the surfaces, the standards of the facilities is not up to scratch, and it's very frustrating. And that's a challenge in more countries than just New Zealand, but the horses are getting more and more valuable. The centres and the surfaces need to come up to match that, because otherwise they'll just, you know, if you have a special young horse, you'll just send it to Europe to produce it. And I think that's a big loss for yourselves. What I think is very special, actually, that we haven't touched on is, I thought that Ireland was one of the most patriotic places that I had been, but there's something quite special about the mindset of the New Zealand breeders that we've been with. It's a lot of the time, if you ask breeders in Europe what they want, and they'll say an Olympic medalist, it's not usually followed by with one of the riders from my own country. We'd obviously like it. It's not that nobody wouldn't like it, but that has come unprompted from a lot of the breeders, that their desire is like the focus on Brisbane 32 is like it's burning strongly in the kind of the minds of everyone that we have been with. And I think that is special, because a lot of the time we're doing this whole breeding endeavour or sport for very little financial resources or financial return, but I think you can really harness that that focus and that patriotism, that people really want to breed horses capable of representing their own riders at major championships and not just representing. I don't think they're going to make up numbers by the sounds of things. And I think that's brilliant, but it does sound like that there's a lot of work to be done on the facilities that are available. And it was really interesting, even just with Mitch and Michaela and family, about their intentions of developing the Young Rider Academy. I think that's going to be incredible, and it's a incredible opportunity not just to develop young riders, but to develop riders, young or old maybe, if they're interested in going this way, who want further education on producing young horses, and that'll trickle down through your entire sector. So again, just they're putting an awful lot of their own time and money into it, and I'm sure there are others that we didn't get the opportunity to meet, but it'd be great to see that supported, and think of ways as breeders that you can feed into that network. I think that would be very important. Do you want to cover any of those?
I'm just conscious about time here, because there's quite a lot to go through, but I think also these presentations, will they be available to everyone afterwards? Yeah. So one thing I would just like to touch on in terms of registration and mandatory registration, as I understand it, it will be mandatory for everyone to register the horse. So that would be a whip for you, but you also need carrots, right? So one thing that really hit things off in Sweden was when we started, it was in the 90s, they started the Breeders' Trophy. And to get into the Breeders' Trophy, each breeder paid a small amount of money when they registered their horse, and the horse had to be registered to get into that competition. So when everyone put in a small amount of money, the money grew. So first time they would compete about this money would be at 5 years old. Nowadays it starts already at 4, but at that time it started at 5-year-olds, and they had 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds. So by then the money would have grown, and at that time it was quite a substantial prize money, which meant that people really wanted to register the horse because they wanted to enter into that competition. And I think those are the kinds of incentives you can have already to set up the carrots, because the whip will come eventually anyway. So to make people want to register.
I had actually written down a note earlier when the lady at the back had asked about eventers, and I know just from my own personal interest is very much on show jumping, and I know a lot of the focus of this trip has been on show jumping, but I just jotted down a few points where maybe things that have helped somewhat on the eventing side in Ireland. We've often produced, because of probably the thoroughbred industry and our history and things like that, and maybe our country, we've probably produced a lot of good eventers, not always fully intentionally, perhaps. And it's probably similar here through kind of the offshoots of your thoroughbred industry, that you've produced a lot of very good eventers, both in terms of thoroughbred crosses, and you've had a lot of very, very successful New Zealand bred thoroughbreds that have gone on to succeed at the highest level. But once you have all the data in place, you can apply different ratings to your stallions, to your mares, and you can rate them based on certain levels of performance, certain levels of progeny performance. So there was a rating system brought in Ireland where they star rated all the approved stallions for their own show jumping performance, for their own offspring show jumping performance, but they did the same in eventing. So then it gives this objective look at kind of who's achieved like set criteria in both disciplines and who's bred for that. Things like foal championships, and that's probably back to the likes of a carrot example, where in Ireland you can compete in these foal championships, and they're not pretty pony classes, where it's just pure showing. They're performance orientated, and they have different scores weighted for different attributes. So say like in the eventing one, trot might be weighted higher, and the jumping one, canter, might be weighted higher. There'll be functional conformation aspects that are probably the same in both, but it's an opportunity for breeders to bring out mares and foals to the regional qualifiers. And there's classes now for ponies, show jumping and eventing, and for horses, show jumping and eventing. And say different judges then for each one that are experienced in both aspects. So you bring your foals out, it's an opportunity for feedback, compare yourself against other mares and foals, and again in that feedback loop, you're not even having to wait until they're old enough to loose jump, that you're getting independent feedback on that. And that's very helpful. There's decent prize money. Obviously it raises the profile if your foal does well, but it's an opportunity for other breeders who mightn't have a foal to put in it or mightn't have the help to put a foal in it, where they can come out and see nice mares and foals. Young horse classes at home, there's a good stud book series, but again you have to have your passport, you have to have your sire and dam recorded, and there's classes for 5, 6 and 7 year olds to develop, and in that there's a requirement that if you apply to host one of those legs, but you have to, as a centre, meet certain criteria. And the young horses have to be in the best rings, so in your best, say, grass ring or whatever, in your main ring, and they have to get profile. Like they have to get kind of nearly priority at a show, or make sure that they're not off in some, back ring that isn't up to scratch. But similarly, for the eventers, then there's been different kind of young horse series or different young horse production, because another theme that has come up here is it sounds like the courses that the young horses here are required to do are rarely built for young horses. That there's the potential for young horses to get wrecked is the short way of putting it in some of the classes that are available. Yep.
3 or 4 people have approached me or talked to me about that situation, is that it's sort of looking like the course builders are building courses to eliminate instead of train our young horses. And I would suspect that there'd be quite a few hands went up amongst riders whether they agreed with me or not. And I think most people would agree with that sentiment. And it's something we really have to address here, and maybe it's a time for a big talk for course builders.
There's lots of different things, and we could spend a long time. Oh, Jenny.
Oh, just one thing that I know you said before that there's not heaps of people that are interested in breeding, but I think a lot of people are, a lot of riders are very interested in what a good horse is, and I think one of the best ways to educate someone is when the sport's running that we should know what the mare is and we should know what the stallion is, and that's where the data feeds in, and that is so missing here.
So just to go back to one thing that Michael mentioned before, this is a free jumping. I know some people say that, well, we're not breeding for free jumping, right? That's not the breeding goal. It's to have them in the highest classes. But actually, the studies that have been done shows that in terms of the same genes being responsible for success as a free jumper and success in competition or young horse competitions, it's actually the free jumping which is most genetically linked to the competition results later in life, more than the results in young horse competition. And that's because the young horse that free jumps or loose jump, I wouldn't know the difference, we say free jump. Anyway, the horse is less affected by the environment when it's young and does the free jumping. And when it jumps as a young horse with the rider has a lot of influence on how that horse would jump. So it's actually easier to see what's genes and what's environment in the free jumping. Then there are those bloodlines that are not suitable for free jumping but would jump a Grand Prix course without problem. There it really is. But you learn that when you start doing it regularly. And if you would start free jumping on a more regular basis, use it as a tool to see the talents in young horses. I would just advise you not to go too much into free jumping competition, because that's when you get the problems. People produce horses to perform well and spectacular in free jumping to get a high price for it. And that's not what we want to use it for. We want to use it as a tool to see what we can get from them to evaluate the stallion's inheritance, the mare's inheritance, and also perhaps to see the talents within the young horse. Of course, it's really stimulating to put up a prize and have free jumping competition, but I would just, a small warning there, that if you have the competitions for the free jumping, you might just produce the horses to the wrong direction.
Just finally, I think, because we're not going to go through them all, one thing when we were, it really struck me in particular, it's an incredible country obviously, but there was one moment that really struck me when we were visiting or staying with Daniel and Chrissy Webb, and was that Hunterville or
Hunterville, yes.
Hunterville. It's all a bit of a blur. We've been driven around quite a lot, but we were at their house when we went up the hills. Emma had the privilege of getting to ride through the hills with Daniel. That's where I miss out because I can't ride. But thankfully he brought us up in the buggy afterwards. But we were up there watching the horses around the hills and looking at these phenomenal views. And the thing is, that wasn't a once-off. That was representative of a lot of the places that we went. And there's these incredible scenes and countryside and just things that you witness that you all take for granted because it's what you're used to. And I would like you, again, individually and collectively, I would love to see nearly a marketing campaign. Maybe this is something relevant for Equestrian Sport New Zealand, but like a kind of a This Is New Zealand campaign, like which has drones going through those hills and the young horses and has the best of what you have to offer and communicate it to the world. Because everybody I've ever known that has been to New Zealand says it's great, but does the horse world fully know and understand and appreciate like kind of just how great it is here? And I think that would maybe encourage more international trade, because by the time that video goes out, you'll all have your passports as well. But I think I think as an organization or as an industry, I think there should be that campaign, and I think the payoffs would far outweigh the investment in photographers and videographers. But then individually, really start to capture some of those things in your own farm that you take for granted and communicate it to the world, because most of the world never has the privilege of experiencing what you experience every day. And I think show people the best of what it is that you're doing individually as well on your own business pages.
Yeah, and obviously you in New Zealand you already do it, but not with the horses, but you do it with your wines and you do it with adventures and experiences. So it's so much today about creating the story or the background. With your wines you talk about terroir. Why not do it with the horses? I mean, it's the same. Horse is actually luxury products, as is wines. So why don't make a package of it, like the concept? People would travel from all over the world just to drink your wines, go around, look at horses, do a jet boat tour. I mean, you actually already have it all in place. You just have to show the world that you have it.
And do the wine first.
That's how the French do it.
Just, I suppose then the final note is one thing, because what we've seen is that there aren't that many opportunities to bring the breeders together. One is start thinking of ways to do that, and shows that you could tie in something, be it international speakers or even you have an awful lot of expertise within your own sector. So think about who you'd like to hear from and either come together as a group or speak to your various representatives and see, maybe it's a National Equine Conference, maybe it's a breeders' talk at some final or World Cup qualifier or something like that. That's one. But what we'd really like to do, and maybe if it exists already, tell me, but I haven't found it, a Facebook group specifically dedicated to New Zealand sport horse breeders, that we would like to add in all the people that we've come across on this trip and just start a group. And it's not that we're going to be, managing everything or holding your hand. It's just to create the space where, like, say, Jenny hit on a podcast and she sent it to Ewen. So that's one person shares something with one person and it's resulted in a trip of a lifetime for us, and 2 breeders groups that it sounds like this is not a common thing. So if we can create those spaces in person or online where if there is a podcast or there's an interesting article or there's an event going on or Jenny's bringing in a tank of semen and does anyone want anything from wherever, it's to just create those spaces for you to all learn and support each other. So next time you see a New Zealand bred horse succeeding worldwide, even if you didn't breed it, I'd like to see you all cheer it on and cheer the breeder on, because it sounds like here there's not enough of that. When somebody succeeds, there's not enough kind of patting them on the back. There's people doing great things here, but nobody's telling them that they are. So just keep that in mind. And that's it from me.
Thank you.
Cool, thank you. I've got so many notes from today, it's unbelievable, and I think we're about 12 pages of notes. Listen, this idea, I think Ewen approached me when I first arrived at ESNZ and started talking about breeding, and I was like, what the hell are you talking about, mate? I've got so many other issues I need to work on. And back, 3 or 4 months ago, we met in Takapoto with a group of, and that came out of a high performance discussion. And to me, this is kind of a high performance discussion. So I'm not trying to play down the number of breeders. I think we've got to do it well and do it excellently, not have hundreds of people doing it badly. If that's the point I was trying to make. So from there, we sort of met with Ewen a few more times, and obviously the team at Takapoto are instrumental in a lot of stuff we're doing around high performance, around the development up there, which is certainly world class. I've yet to see anything that probably betters it. And there's other plans with Mitch afoot as well, as he started to talk to you about. And as a federation, we're hugely excited about that and what that could mean for the future of our athletes and our horses, and we know the need that both those things need to be excellent. We can't have one being excellent. It's got to be connected, and the system has to be connected. So that's really important for us. It's interesting what we say about minimum standards. I think for the first year ever, the World Cup show jumping rounds, some minimum standards were applied for selection. So it's taken 75 years, but it's happened this year, so that's good. And I'm just wondering too, and I don't know the answer to this, but all the horses in our 5, 6, 7-year-old classes that go to our age group show, do they have to be chipped? And I don't know the answer to that. And as jumpers, so there's another thing that quite quickly we could go to show jumping, and this is this is about a discussion between us all, right? No one of us can do it on our own, but if we're going to run a show for horses of ages, and most of that is about the breeding for wherever those horses end up, then collectively we need to push a lot stronger on whoever it is that's making those decisions. So to me that's potentially quite exciting. So I guess we've rolled forward really quickly from our meeting at Takapoto, and we find ourselves here today with I wasn't sure how many people would be here, and I'm excited that there's this many people that are interested enough to give up their time to come and learn. And I think we're on this exciting journey at the moment, and everything you said about New Zealand is right. We've done it so well with other industries. How do we do the same with our equine industry? But if we don't get the bedrocks right, there's kind of nowhere to go. And having 1 or 2 people push it's not enough. It's got to be a movement. So I guess we need to talk with the breeders about who wants to run the Facebook page. How do we set that up? How do we get that interactive? We run Horse of the Year every year. We have the Young Horse Show. We have an AGA. Is that 3 times? And we should have a breeding component added to all of those, because half the people that are coming to the conference are interested in breeding anyway. So much to think about, so many opportunities, but really exciting at the same time. So, to Ewen, a huge thank you for, what's the right word, pushing, realising there's an opportunity, and I think that perseverance, and we've finally got a bit of oxygen in the office. We can say, okay, actually, how do we drive this, and how do we do that? So the work that you've done, and to Penny and all the other helpers, and I'll miss somebody if I try and name too many people, but I wasn't up north, but a classic is, I know Jock came along to your seminar last week, and I spoke to him the day before he went. He goes, I don't really know what that's going to be like, and it's a lot of time that I'm giving up. Anyway, he rang me afterwards and said it's one of the best days he's had in his job. So that gives some indication of, you know, the leader of our high performance program. We know that horsepower is really important to us. Like, it's the one thing, if you talk to all of our riders, horsepower is the biggest challenge we have. And we can either buy it, like we have before, or we can breed it, or we can have New Zealand owners involved too. We lose horses during Olympic campaigns because people that own horses from other countries will sell them. But at the same time, we've actually got overseas owners with horses in our high performance program. So it's a bit of a mixture, but we'd love to have way more control, and control from within New Zealand. So lots to do, but to Emma and Michael, as I say, I've been sitting there writing notes for flat out for the last 2.5 hours. Your knowledge, never heard anything like it before. I guess your interest and your passion is something that is infectious, and I can see why Ewen landed really quickly with the two of you. I think we're really fortunate to have you out here, and I'm pretty sure it won't be 10 years till you're back here. I think we need to look at how we keep rolling this forward from here, and if it's not the two of you, then who's the next speaker, and who's the next person that will challenge our thinking, and also, you know, our ability to come and test and learn. Let's try some stuff and come back and talk to the two of you through our breeding, and, you know, how can we do it better and quicker? How do we learn quickly and fail quickly? I think it's a really interesting point. Like a lot of things in life, all of a sudden you hold on for some things in this particular area in high performance, before you know it, you've missed the opportunity. So, you know, a huge thank you. I'd say, you know, understand your why you're here, why you're breeding. Fail fast is really important. So there are two key messages I've taken out of today. But a huge thank you for making time. I guess it's not the worst place to come for a holiday. There's worse countries, I'm sure. So travel safely home. Lucky to have had you for the time that you've been here. I'm lucky I think I get to have dinner with you tonight as well and keep picking your brains. So just on behalf of everybody in the room, massive thank you to you and to you both for making all of this happen. Thank you.
If anybody has specific questions that they just want to talk to one-to-one, make sure that you get them out.